Good morning. The committee will come to order. Before we get started this morning, I just want to take a moment to express my sincerest condolences on the passing last week of our friend and colleague, Representative Louise Slaughter. She was truly an institution within this body, and her candor, her intelligence, her humor, and her passion will be deeply missed. Today, our committee is honored to welcome back U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer to testify on President Trump's trade policy agenda. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. Our country was born because of trade. We've led the world in commerce and trade for the last century. Trade's part of everything we do as Americans. The freedom to trade is our greatest economic freedom. It's the freedom to buy, sell, and compete anywhere in the world with as little government interference as possible. Through trade, America's built roads and bridges, towns and cities. We brought peace, freedom, and hope to our people and the nations of the world. At this moment, we stand at a crossroads. If we stand still, or worse, take the path of isolationism, we'll abandon our greatest freedom and the very DNA of what makes us Americans. There's a better path. We're already seeing benefits from the historic tax cuts that President Trump just signed into law, which is increasing America's competitiveness and making us the best place on the planet to do business in. Our trade policy must build on that growth. In a competitive world, it's not enough to merely buy American. We have to sell American to the billions of customers outside America. That's how we help our local businesses and farmers create American jobs and spur American economic growth. Mr. Ambassador, America must continue to lead. We lead and Americans win when we open up markets for our products and services through high standard, ambitious, and enforceable trade agreements. This has to be our top priority. If we don't break open new markets through trade agreements with countries like Japan, the UK, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership 11, we'll be left behind. China and Europe will write the rules, and they'll cut American producers and workers out of other markets. We can't wait any longer while others pass us by. I strongly support President Trump's request for TPA renewal. I look forward to your report showing how you'll use it to negotiate agreements that are consistent with congressional objectives and good for America, as you've set out to do, Mr. Ambassador. I'm pleased with your progress to modernize NAFTA, the largest and most successful trading relationship in the world. U.S. Trade Representative's Office and you, Ambassador, your team, have worked tirelessly to achieve bold and ambitious standards. I'm hopeful we'll be able to vote on and pass a new modern NAFTA for America by year end. That said, the road ahead isn't easy. Congress wants strong protections for intellectual property, increased market access for our dairy farmers, and an end to Canada and Mexico's harshly restrictive customs barriers, such as unreasonably low de minimis levels. We need workable solutions on rules of origin and procurement that recognize how Americans benefit from global supply chains. Otherwise, we lose out to China. I also caution that any agreement without a binding dispute settlement, including investor-state dispute settlement, won't find sufficient support in Congress. Congress explicitly set out this requirement in TPA, knowing it's the only way to hold trading partners accountable and to make sure that strong agreement you negotiate, Mr. Ambassador, our trading partners will be held accountable. America must also lead on China. China's chronic oversupply in steel and aluminum has put many Americans out of work and companies out of business. It's a blatant theft of our company's technology and intellectual property, and it can't be tolerated. I believe strong enforcement is needed, and I appreciate President Trump's leadership on holding China accountable. But we can't do this alone. If we hurt our allies, America will ultimately lose. Our challenge, and every president's challenge, is to target remedies to address true national security risks, to eliminate unfair trade, and take into account our entire economy. The wrong remedy puts significant American jobs at risk. We have to make sure we don't punish American families and workers for China's misbehaviors. Oftentimes, indiscriminate tariffs are not the right approach, and before the administration puts those in place, it also should provide a strong opportunity for public comment so the effect of these tariffs on our economy can be properly assessed. It's not about backing down, it's about hitting the target, which is China and its bad practices, not our allies or other U.S. sectors. And finally, I want to be clear. The Constitution vests Congress with the authority of the U.S. trade policy agenda. The relationship between Congress and executive branch is a true partnership in implementing that agenda. We want to partner with you, Mr. Ambassador, to ensure that America continues to choose the freedom to trade. America must continue to lead the world in defining what it means to have an open and free economy. Our jobs and our values depend upon it. Again, Ambassador Lighthizer, thank you so much for being here today on a snow day. We look forward to your testimony. I now yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Neal, for the purposes of his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And for those of us from New England, we don't even consider this a snow day. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and I want to welcome you on behalf of committee Democrats. Today's hearing is an opportunity for us to hear from you and you to hear from us about all of the activity that is happening on the trade front. Over the past year, we've seen a great deal of activity and commentary from the administration. You are currently in the process of renegotiating NAFTA to update it and, more importantly, to rebalance it. You're also renegotiating the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement to improve it, to ensure that it delivers more reciprocal outcomes for U.S. workers, exporters, and businesses. The administration has recently decided to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum imports under Section 232 and is currently in the process of deciding on country exemptions and product exclusions. As we are reading in news reports, in a matter of days, the administration will announce its findings in the Section 301 investigation into Chinese intellectual property abuses and may also be prepared to impose substantial tariffs on imports from China. The President certainly has tapped into raw feelings in some important communities about our economy and trade policies. We have seen in the past months that this administration and you personally, Mr. Ambassador, have not been shy about challenging the status quo. For many of us, we have taken notice of the promises that the administration has made to improve U.S. trade policy and to make it work for all Americans. Many of us in the past have been skeptical about the promises that have been made for better enforcement because oftentimes they are big promises, and we must say we've heard them before. But we have seen evidence of your commitment. For example, we hear that when you say that your task is not just to renegotiate NAFTA, but to update it and to fundamentally restructure it to fix important flaws of the original agreement, flaws that prevented members of Congress like me from supporting it originally. In the tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, we recognize the intention of providing much-needed relief to industries and workers that have called for action for a very long time. But we also have a lot of questions, and we're watching closely to determine whether the promises the administration has made will be delivered upon, whether that is in NAFTA, the 232 tariffs, the Korean Agreement, or China's 301 investigation. Finally, in the bigger picture, I think it should be clear to all of us that some of the greatest challenges facing our economy and our values are being posed by countries that rely heavily on state intervention and do not operate, despite what they say, on market-based principles. We should all be on the same team in talking about these challenges. In fact, if we want to be really effective, it seems to me that it will make a good deal of sense that we should build upon what already has been happening between Democrats and Republicans as we address many of these challenges. I look forward to hearing from you today about your vision and plan for delivering this administration's promises on trade, about how we take on global competitive challenges effectively, and how the administration partners with Congress. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Today's sole witness is Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, U.S. Trade Representative. The committee, Mr. Ambassador, has received your written statement. It will be made part of the formal hearing record. We've reserved 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. You may begin when you're ready. And again, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Neal and members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here today. We at USTR greatly appreciate the expertise of the members of this committee. We're grateful for all the time you give us in working up truly bipartisan trade policy, the effort you've helped us with on NAFTA and the many issues we face. Before I continue with my statement, let me just say, since I generally, when I come here, complain about the fact that I have no deputies, I in fact have deputies now. So I thought it would be appropriate, since they're all going to be senior members, I believe, but members of your staffs, that I probably ought to at least have you know who's working for you now besides me. Jeffrey Garish, maybe if you'd stand up, Jeff, is our deputy for Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. C.J. Mahoney is our deputy for Africa, China, the Western Hemisphere, and he's also going to do investment and services. And he will be our transparency officer. You'll recall that we selected an appointed official as our transparency officer. So those are the two people that I wanted you to focus on, if you would, since they're brand new. First, I would like to draw the committee's attention to the fact that this year the trade deficit in goods and services rose to $565 billion, and in goods alone it was $811 billion. Of course, these numbers, there are lots of causes for these numbers, but the President believes, and I also agree, that longstanding trade deficits to some extent reflect market distortions and that they're having a negative effect on U.S. workers and businesses. We also, of course, have a massive trade deficit with China, which we ought to speak about at some point, of $375 billion. So the numbers essentially got worse last year. I know that members have a variety of views on these figures, but the President believes that they raise significant concerns. They indicate that sometimes the global rules of trade make it harder for U.S. companies to compete and specifically to export. Trade deficit also indicate that in the United States, the cost of globalization are falling more heavily on blue-collar workers. And this is something that is bad for the economy and bad for the society. Finally, they tend to undermine the support for the global trading system. So trade deficits are a problem. Quickly, I would outline the President's trade agenda. First, we at USTR will support the President's national security strategy. If you haven't looked at that, I would recommend it to you. That means that our trade policy will help to build a stronger America, preserve our national sovereignty, respond to hostile economic competitors, recognize the importance of technology, and seek opportunities to work with other countries that share our goals. Second, for U.S. companies and workers to be competitive in overseas markets, we need a strong and robust economy at home, and I commend the committee for the work they did on the tax cut bill. Third, we are negotiating trade deals that will work for all Americans. As members of this committee well know, the President directed us to seek significant changes to NAFTA. We have already had 7 rounds with our partners in Canada and Mexico, and I believe that we've made a great deal of progress. We've also begun discussions, as most of you know, with South Korea on updating course. Now that we have a full team of deputies, we intend to aggressively pursue other potential free trade agreements. We have a trade working group with the United Kingdom. We have told Japan that we're interested in having a free trade agreement with them at the appropriate time. We are prepared to explore the possible countries in Africa and South Asia who might be appropriate for us to enter into free trade agreements. And as you said, Mr. Chairman, the President has asked for the extension of Trade Promotion Authority to accomplish this. Fourth, we are enforcing our trade laws. The President indicated he would use all available trade laws to defend U.S. workers, farmers, and ranchers against unfair trade, and he is, in fact, doing that. Finally, we seek to reform the multilateral trading system. For too long, the WTO has failed to promote trade liberalization. Too many WTO members view it as a litigation forum and not as a negotiation forum. In short, USTR, under the direction of President Trump, is seeking to build a better, fairer system of global trade that will lead to higher standards for all Americans. Thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you for introducing your chief negotiators. Mr. Neal and I did send a letter to the Senate after your last testimony discussion with us, urging the Senate to move, so we're pleased to, in a bipartisan way.
Let me just say that I view that as unprecedented and extremely helpful, so I'm very grateful to the committee for intervening in that process.
No, look, you need a full team. USTR is a very small and nimble agency, needs everyone on board at this critical moment, so congratulations on that. So I'm convinced NAFTA, done right, can create incredible job growth and paycheck growth for America, our farmers, our workers, our local businesses. I think it is a modern NAFTA is our number one economic priority this year. And I believe not only will it grow jobs in America, but when combined with our trading partners, can make our American businesses and farmers more competitive against China, Europe, and the rest of the world. I want to ask you a question about that in a moment. But first, let's start with the steel and aluminum tariffs. We strongly support President Trump's efforts to target unfairly traded steel and aluminum. But as you know, we've made it clear it's important that we allow fairly traded steel and aluminum to move forward. It's critical for nearly every economic sector in America. In the President's determination was included an exemption process for countries to negotiate with you, Mr. Ambassador, and the President directly in order to address transshipment issues, multinational efforts against China's unfair trade practices, and strengthening America's national security footprint. Can you give us an update on the exemption process?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you say, the President did set in force a process that would allow products to get out in specific countries, in specific circumstances, and that's something that's being handled by the Department of Commerce. And then USTR, working with all the appropriate agencies, including the Department of Commerce, is working on this question of country exemptions. So initially, the NAFTA countries are out of the 232, subject to certain conditions and subject to a successful NAFTA negotiation. So that's the first part of it. We have a similar circumstance with respect to Korea because we're in the process of renegotiating KORUS. I guess I have to be careful because we're not using TPA. I won't say renegotiating, but refurbishing perhaps KORUS. But we're talking to the Koreans about KORUS. There have been other countries that have come up and that I believe we are in the process of talking to now, Australia, Argentina, and the EU, I would put in those categories. There are a couple of there have been a number who have asked, a great number, as you can imagine. Another one that we will, I think, soon begin talking to is Brazil. But there are a number of countries that have come forward, and they're in various levels of the process. The kinds of things we've talked about, well, maybe I'll let it go at that, Mr. Chairman, and then follow up on the criteria later. If you
Great, thank you. What's the time frame for those discussions and on ultimate decisions roughly?
I believe that countries will get out as we come to agreement that some countries will be in a position where the duties will not apply to them during the course of the negotiation, just so that you don't have, for example, Canada and Mexico, but others, so you don't have a situation where you have the status quo, 25% tariff, and then they get out, and there's this kind of bump, and it changes real commercial relationships. So, but our hope is that by the end of April, we have this part of the process resolved. Having said that, the President has the authority at any time during the course of the program to let people out if he thinks it's in the national economic interest of the United States.
And those discussions are ongoing?
Yes, sir, they are ongoing.
Thank you. So let me turn to NAFTA for a final question. You know, I'm confident you and your team are going to negotiate a pro-growth NAFTA that makes America stronger economically. To do that and to maximize the economic growth from our now one of the most competitive tax codes in the world, to maximize on that, we need more customers. And many of those customers live outside the United States. Many of them are in Mexico and Canada. And when we compete and win on a level playing field, we grow American jobs here. But to do that, we oftentimes have to invest in those home countries to compete and win against China, Europe, and the rest of the world. But if that investment in those countries is to benefit America, our investors have to receive fair treatment from other governments. And many countries don't provide basic, substantive, or procedural protections for American businesses. That means American investors have to rely on the investor-state dispute settlement process to ensure that they're treated fairly and they aren't discriminated against in these other countries, that the rule of law, the property and investment is protected as it is in America. And without ISDS, Americans' property is left unprotected against discrimination, foreign seizure, regulatory abuses, and other forms of unfair action. This issue is basically a question. When other countries treat American investment unfairly, who has their back? The answer should be America has their back. I'm deeply concerned about reports Mexico and Canada have begun negotiating bilateral ISDS provisions without us, because USTR has said it doesn't want to participate in that. Mr. Schweikert from Arizona has led a letter that many of us have signed now, signed by 103 Republicans, affirming that inclusion of a strong ISDS is essential in the NAFTA agreement. Mr. Ambassador, we've had many discussions about that. This is a key part of passing a strong NAFTA agreement that we're convinced you'll negotiate well for us. So, how do you square USTR's current proposal against the congressional objectives that are in law and that 103 of us have, as of today, said are crucial for passage of this agreement?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'm aware that there is some controversy surrounding ISDS.
You picked up on that?
Yeah, I have picked up on that. I would say this about it, first of all, that whatever happens on ISDS, the kinds of issues that members are concerned about in terms of U.S. investment overseas will be able to be handled within the context of what we call Chapter 20 of the state-to-state dispute settlement. So it isn't like we will be in a position where there will be no recourse. So that is the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say that we have proposed an opt-in, opt-out proposal. We are skeptical about ISDS for a variety of reasons, which I would like to go into if I have a second to do it. Number one, on the U.S. side, there are questions of sovereignty. Why should a foreign national be able to come in and not have the rights of Americans in the American court system, but have more rights than Americans have in the American court system? It doesn't strike me, it strikes me as something that's at least, we ought to at least be skeptical of and analyze. So a U.S. person goes into a court system, goes through the system, and they're stuck with what they get. A foreign national can do that, and then at the end of the day say, I want 3 guys in London to say we're going to overrule the entire U.S. system. So on the inward bound, it strikes me as a question of sovereignty, and I view myself as a conservative and a sovereigntist. So this is troubling on that respect. On the outgoing side, there are many people who believe that in some circumstances, and I can discuss the varieties of, in some circumstances, it's more of an outsourcing issue. So what is it? It's a situation where somebody says, I want to move a plant from Texas and I want to put it in Mexico. And when I go down there, I don't want to take the political risk that AMLO is going to win in Mexico and change my bargain. So I want the U.S. government essentially to buy political risk insurance for me. Our view tends to be that if you want to move a plant from the United States to Mexico and the economics suggest that, then you should go with the economics, and it's too bad. And your responsibility as a Congress is to make the U.S. more competitive so that that isn't a problem. But if you're going there because we are underwriting the investment, we are putting our finger on the scale, we're encouraging you to move your plant down there, that's not the job, in my opinion at least, of the United States government. I would say also this is an area that's not without controversy. The National Association of States Attorney General think this is a mistake. The Cato Institute, an issue which I don't always agree with, a libertarian issue, they think ISDS is something that we shouldn't have. The National Association of State Legislatures, which is controlled by Republicans, is on record as against ISDS. So there are a whole variety of issues. I can go on and on and on. People will respond, well, we haven't lost cases in the United States in our position. And while, in fact, that is the case, we have come close to losing some, but more importantly, we've had situations where real regulation, which should be in place, which is bipartisan in everybody's interest, has not been put in place because of fears of ISDS. So I think it is something we have to think about very carefully. Our view was that rather than have this mandatory ISDS provision, which we think is is a problem in terms of our sovereignty in the United States, encourages outsourcing and losing jobs in the United States, and by the way, lowering standards in a variety of places, that we should be very careful before we put something like that into place. So you say, what are the alternatives for these companies? The first alternative, as I say, is state-to-state dispute settlement. The second alternative is if you go to any one of these companies and ask them, why do you need this? Why don't you put in place an arbitration provision in your contract? They'll all say, well, we could do that. And indeed, they did do it. Did it before we hired ISDS. And in a country like Mexico, they subscribe to all the conventions, and they have to enforce those. If they put that contract, an arbitration provision in their contract, these things are then resolved in a similar manner, but without the United States ceding sovereignty in order to encourage people to outsource jobs. It's just not a good trade, in my opinion. I realize, however, that it's a controversial provision and that my view is in the minority in some very intelligent caucuses.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for that defense. A couple quick thoughts before I turn to Mr. Neal. Secondly, there is no threat to sovereignty. Foreign investors have no more rights than American investors because in our country, you have the greatest standards and protections for property rights, investment rights in the world, bar none. Secondly, your client is Congress. In speaking out for our ag community that wants you to have America's back when they have to invest in other countries to win customers, energy, manufacturing, technology, services, every key industry in America that has to compete against China and the rest of the world and other countries is saying we need to have their back when they make their investments. And so you're right, there is a disagreement there. We're going to continue to work together with you, Mr. Ambassador, to get to a good place, to make sure we're keeping this in a trade agreement, and we have the backs of our American investors. Mr.
Just
Neal.
say briefly, the strongest argument in favor of ISDS, Mr. Chairman, is that you're in favor of it. That's the strongest argument, in my opinion.
Some would disagree with that, Mr. Ambassador. So, Mr. Neal, you're recognized for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. In Massachusetts and in New England, trade and energy with Canada is critical to powering our engines of innovation, manufacturing, and indeed people's lives. And renegotiating NAFTA to ensure the reliable and preferential terms of that trade is a priority, certainly for communities across New England. In trade, I understand that there are some issues with verifying origin right now that are having the effect of burdening trade and making power more expensive for people across New England. Is this something that's on the radar screen, and are you willing to prioritize the resolution of these burdens as part of the renegotiation?
Yes, Mr. Neal, they are, and free flow of energy is something that I've testified before, and I know that I believe that the committee is universally in agreement on that provision, and we certainly support it, and we're aware of your situation, and it's something that we're concerned about.
Thank you. China. As I mentioned earlier, we're reading about substantial tariffs on a wide variety of consumer product imports from China that will apparently be announced before the week is over. Can you talk about the goals of the administration and what you're trying to achieve through Section 301? And do the goals in China's abusive practices correspond to the types of products that you are thinking of subjecting to tariffs? Whether it's in electronics or toys, iconic companies in many of our districts and consumers that rely upon them and enjoy these goods are profoundly concerned that some of these penalties will end up penalizing them as well. And can you talk about, from your perspective, what makes sense for our economy, or are we simply proposing to discipline China?
Mr. Ambassador, could you touch that microphone?
I'm sorry.
Thanks, sir.
I'm sorry. That is a great question and one that is quite topical, as you suggest. The President is going to make a decision, I believe, in the very near future on this issue of this 301, which we started in August, and which has been very thoroughly examined at USTR. We've studied it, we've had hearings, we've spent thousands of hours reading tens of thousands of pages in Chinese. We have studied with American companies. And our view is that, and once again, there's no decision until the president makes it. But our view is that we have a very serious problem of losing our intellectual property, which is really the biggest single advantage of the American economy, in my opinion, is our intellectual property and our ability to generate new intellectual property. We are losing that to China in ways that are not reflective of the underlying economics. So it's an enormously important issue. I'm happy to talk about it at some length. We think it is perhaps the most important thing that will have been done in a long time in terms of rebalancing trade, and trade specifically with China. This problem of intellectual property with China has been something that's been going on for a long, long time. If you look back in George Herbert Walker's presidency in 1991, there was a 301 on the Chinese basically not protecting intellectual property in China and taking the technology. 1991. We had another one in the Clinton administration, both of which didn't really amount to much. We had a third one in the Obama administration where there was cyber theft in an agreement. Of course, none of this changed any of the activity in my judgment. So the question becomes, one, do you think there's a problem? It strikes me as without question clear that there is. Do you thoroughly study it, which I believe we did? If there is a problem, if it's so important to the economy, what are the likely remedies that you would have? The remedies, in my judgment at least, would be, one, doing something on the tariff front, and two, doing something on the investment front, and then perhaps other things, because these are the crucial areas where it comes together. In terms of what you would do on the tariff front, which was your specific question, the USTR has the power at the direction of the president to raise tariffs in these circumstances. The way we would approach it if the president should make this decision is, one, to study it. We have an algorithm which will decide the extent to which there is a problem among things that are quantifiable, because it's a huge number of things that are not quantifiable but are worth hundreds of billions. But you take what you believe is quantifiable and you come up with a number. Then you apply tariffs to that number. The process that you would use, presumably, would be, one, you would develop an algorithm that'll put maximum pressure on China, minimum pressure on U.S. consumers, and then there are certain products which are clearly high-tech products which are in the focus point of this. And the combination of those two would be the kinds of things that you would decide to put tariffs on if you were going to do it, and then you would take additional action. Now, I can go through at some detail if the committee wants to do it now or another time. I know this is a matter of great interest to the committee, and I'm happy to talk about it now or just beyond that, or just go on and wait for other members to ask questions.
It's up to you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, welcome. As you know, I flew F-86s in Korea and had my share of dogfights over there, and that's a dangerous area of the world. And one of our allies, South Korea, needs to know that we've got their back. As you may know, I voted for the U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Agreement back in 2011, and since that time, hundreds of thousands of jobs have been created right here in America from the trade agreement. In fact, over 40,000 jobs in Texas are directly tied to that agreement. By the way, according to your own agency, exports of goods have increased as a result of the agreement. So as the President looks to renegotiate this trade agreement, I'd like to express my support for doing it in a way that strengthens the alliance with South Korea. Mr. Ambassador, can you give me an update on the South Korea negotiations, and when will they wrap up, do you think?
Well, yeah, thank you very much. So we are in the process of having discussions. The President announced his desire to update and rebalance to the extent we can, not using TPA. So it's a more limited kind of a negotiation. Several months ago, we spent the first several months with the Koreans going through their process to get a mandate from their own legislature to discuss it. We've now had several rounds. The Korean minister, Minister Kim, is in town right now. I think we're down to the last few issues. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to come to some agreement that will make the committee happy. And in addition to chorus, of course, we're also talking about steel and aluminum because it has now come up. And in the opinion of many people, Korea is a particular problem in the area of steel primarily. But we're trying to work our way through all of those things. I'm hopeful that we can make headway on it. And it certainly is my objective would be to get a good amendment, a good agreement, to have amendments to the agreement that will satisfy this committee. And I think we're moving in that direction right now, Congressman.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to take my remaining time to highlight the importance of NAFTA for Texas and the nation as a whole. As you know, over 1 million jobs in Texas are supported by trade with Canada and Mexico, and nationwide, this trade supports nearly 14 million American jobs. That's a lot of American workers, and while I support the efforts to update NAFTA, I'm concerned by the proposed sunset clause. I don't think that's good policy necessarily. Businesses need certainty. Can you tell me what the status of the proposed NAFTA sunset clause is, and what are you trying to accomplish with it?
Absolutely, Congressman. So the way the sunset clause works is that at the end of 5 years, the president would make a decision as to whether or not the agreement should continue. It would not require congressional action. It would not be a difficult decision. The thought behind it is, number one, we have a number of members in this committee, particularly on the Republican side, that believe we ought to be sunsetting things. So I would have thought this would have been something that would be consistent with that. The idea is if it's such a good agreement, then we'll naturally roll it over. If it's not a good agreement, we won't. So after a period of time, the idea is that after a period of time, we ought to be sitting down and reviewing what happens to these agreements. There's nothing about trade, in my opinion, that makes it above all other logic in the way we approach legislation. So the basic idea of an agreement like this is that you have baseline WTO trade, and then we're giving someone a benefit versus the rest of the world. And they're giving us approximately similar benefit. And that's how you create an FTA. If you find yourself in a position at some point, and I would suggest 5 years is a reasonable period of time, where what we gave and what we got is so out of balance, it's reasonable to suggest that we ought to try to rebalance it. Things change, the economy changes. Indeed, I would think that NAFTA is a classic example of why we have this problem. We have a 24-year agreement, and that agreement, the whole economy has changed. We've gotten way out of whack in terms of what our deficits are. It's having a peculiar effect on various industries, and it's reasonable to sit back and take a look at it. But if the agreement is, as business people tell me, going to be so spectacular, it strikes me that the president looking at it after 5 years won't be a particularly large hurdle. But it's a reasonable thing to expect people to do, and that's the nature of it. So
Thank you, Mr. Baxter. I apologize. Time has expired. We'll be able to discuss that. Thank you some further as we go through. Mr. Johnson, thank you. Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
Ambassador, welcome. The two major trade issues, NAFTA and steel, have a major common attribute. The clash over both of them has been decades in the making. After the failure to act by the U.S. government and to be acknowledged as a problem by traditional trade theorists, outsourcing in manufacturing to Mexico increased dramatically, lured by Mexico's industrial policy of cheap labor. During much of this same period, as you know so well, China undertook a massive increase in steel production, often using state-owned enterprises reaching 10 times that of U.S. production, in contrast to their equal amounts of production nearly 20 years earlier. The impact in the industrial sector from these two developments was loss of middle-class jobs and suppression of wages. In both cases, the response was the lack of any coordinated action in this country, either handcuffed by allegiance to theories ill-equipped for the realities of rapidly advancing globalization, by a willingness to settle for talk in conference after conference, or by putting profits over the personal impact on working families. This created a vacuum. Like any problems left to foster, it has made it more difficult to remedy them effectively and responsibly. They must be. As to steel and aluminum, I suggest we all look at a recommendation in the recent remarks of AFL-CIO President Rich Trumka, where he said, and I quote, these tariffs will be most effective if used strategically, targeting China and other countries that are the source of the problem. In fact, instead of retaliating against the U.S., as some have threatened, our allies should work together with us to address this global glut that threatens our economic and national security. As to NAFTA, there cannot be a successful renegotiation, Mr. Ambassador, which I believe most Democrats want, unless the central problem, as we have discussed, is fixed. Mexico must tear down its structures of an industrial policy built on suppressing its workers that impacts American jobs and wages. Instead, there is evidence that in its Congress, Mexico is now moving backwards. Mexican workers today often make less in real dollar terms than they did 25 years ago, and less on the average now than those in China. I recently met 2 workers in Mexico from the auto parts industry who said their take-home pay was 75 cents an hour in one case and $1.25 in the other. The President has spoken about this suppression. Now he must deliver. Mr. Ambassador, we've talked about this, and are you now addressing this problem? Steel we'll talk about tomorrow with the Commerce Secretary, though you're an expert. In terms of Mexico and their industrial policy, their endless so-called protection agreements, where are the discussions?
Well, thank you, Congressman Levin. As you know, every time I've testified here, I've taken the position that wage increases in Mexico are in the U.S. interest. It's better for our own competition. It also creates customers for us. So it's something that we have as a priority. I think that in the Mexican political system, there are a number of people who agree completely with that process. So, I mean, with that thought. We are in the process of having these negotiations, really even as of today. My focus has been on trying to get to a position where Mexican workers actually vote on, have real secret ballot votes on their collective bargaining agreements. And if Mexican workers have real votes and they decide for bad contracts, that's none of our business. But it is reasonable for American workers to expect that there will be a process whereby Mexican workers have this.
Good. Could I let me just say on ISDS, and I'll finish with this and there'll be discussion. It's an important issue, and when we raised it in TPP, Republicans just sat doing nothing. But it isn't the basic problem in terms of Mexico. They are using monies to lure industry, not cracking down on American investment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Nunes, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, welcome and congratulations on finally getting your deputies in place. And I want to go first into another region of the world, and that's Asia. You've talked a little bit about what you may do in the coming weeks. And I can assure you that we have tremendous concerns about investment that's being made here in the United States, buying up companies, stealing our intellectual property. A lot of that's not actually being done through trade. It's just the way that they make investments into the United States. And on the Intelligence Committee, we continue to investigate that. And we have legislation pending in the Congress now on CFIUS reforms as it relates to some of these concerns we have with what China is doing here in the United States. I would also submit that I heard you, I think you've talked a little bit about the Philippines, possibly Vietnam. Perhaps another direction that we can go in the coming weeks and months would be to look at, is it possible to do bilateral agreements with the Philippines, Vietnam, fixing the South Korean agreement, possibly Japan? And I don't know if you can comment on any of those negotiations, because I know you're in the middle of them, but in terms of planning for the Philippines and Vietnam, I'd be very interested in.
Thank you, Congressman. First of all, the issue of Chinese investment in the U.S. is, as I say in the 301, is something that we're completely focused on. In my judgment, this is going to help to define whether or not we have all succeeded or failed in terms of what we were sent here to do. And any members who are not on the Intelligence Committee, I hope they access themselves with the information the Intelligence Committee has, because I think in making these judgments, it's really important that you know the basic facts. Having said that, now that I have a deputy, I've spoken generally about the idea of having a bilateral agreement or an FTA with some of these people in that part of the world, in the Pacific part of the world. Some of the TPP countries, but also some others who weren't in the TPP, like the Philippines. So Ambassador Garish, my deputy, is going to undertake to do a thorough study of that, both within the administration, but as importantly within Congress, to find out where the targets are. We have spoken and thought ourselves about the Philippines as a reasonable first step in that direction. It's extremely important that we have a positive agenda. It's extremely important that we show that part of the world that we're very interested in them. Besides the Philippines, which is kind of a smaller kind of a deal generally, smaller economy. You mentioned Vietnam. Vietnam is one that there's been a number of members and people in the administration that also thinks we ought to be moving there. Each of these has their own kind of complications, of course. Japan, we've indicated that we are interested in, at the appropriate time, having an FTA with Japan. Right now, I believe it's not that time. Japan is in the process of having the TPP become implemented, and it was just signed on the 8th of this month. So there's a kind of a process there, but they're very much aware that we think having a closer economic relationship with them is in our interest and is in their interest.
Well, Ambassador, thank you for that. I appreciate that, and I'd be willing to work with you on any of the countries in Asia that you'd be interested in making bilateral agreements or beginning the discussions at least. Let me switch quickly to NAFTA, the NAFTA renegotiations, and then the chairman mentioned in his opening statement, but for a long time, Canada has been getting away with murder in their dairy industry. It's causing tremendous problems for farmers here in the United States. They have a very protectionist program, have for a long time. They're dumping in product into this country, and if anything, it's one of the reasons why you are trying to update NAFTA. And I don't know if you can update us on the process and where we're at in the negotiations on specifically on dairy, but we'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, this is something that we have focused on. It was one of our objectives, their dairy program, but also their agriculture programs in other areas. Eggs and poultry is another one where they have what you would consider to be very not market-oriented, very protectionist approaches on these things. It's difficult for them to change their policies in these areas because they're sensitive, just like they are in every single district in America. Having said that, it's a very high priority to make changes in the Canadian dairy program so that we have the kind of access that U.S. farmers did have, and even greater access. So it's a high priority. I'm hopeful that when we put the final deal together, it's something that we make real headway on.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador. NAFTA is very important in Texas. It was signed in the district that I currently represent in San Antonio, and I sincerely appreciate your efforts to significantly improve it, learning from the experience of the last 2 decades. Though I personally continue to support more trade through NAFTA and around the world, one of the major reasons that I have voted against a number of previous trade agreements is the way they have been subverted by various special interests to serve their own selfish agenda to the detriment of our public health. Big tobacco, big pharma have been examples of that in the past. And I'm very troubled by this morning's New York Times front page story that advises that your office is currently involved in NAFTA negotiations to serve the obesity lobby. You're aware, Ambassador, that the Center for Disease Control reports that almost a third of American youth between the ages of 17 and 24 are too overweight to serve in our military, that the Defense Department reports that 1 in 13 American service members is clinically obese. Now, I know there is no panacea for this problem, and I don't endorse every action taken by a foreign government, but I think that it is wrong to limit the power of American states and local governments as well as foreign governments to address this challenge. I want to draw your attention specifically to that Times article in which it is said the Trump administration's proposal and the corporate pressure behind it hold the potential to handcuff public health interests for the decades. The American provision seeks to prevent any warning symbol, shape, or color that, quote, and this is apparently drawn from the documents you're advancing, inappropriately denotes that a hazard exists from consumption of the food or non-alcoholic beverages. Is it correct that your office is urging adoption of that provision as a part of the NAFTA renegotiation?
Well, first of all, I'd like to put my office on the record as being against obesity.
I'm glad to hear it. The question is whether you're against things that prevent us addressing that problem. And if you're supporting this provision, you're certainly not.
Well, I guess I would say, Congressman, that for us it is slightly more nuanced than that.
Well, just answer first, is this a provision that's being advanced by the American government now?
The idea is, yes, the idea of putting limits on the ability of countries to put warning labels or symbols on products is something that we are concerned about.
So it is accurate that this provision, the language that I just read to you, is being advanced by our negotiators?
I can't comment on the exact language. It's in the statute. I don't have, what's in the article, I don't have the article in front of me. But the issue is one that we're concerned about. The other side, your point is an excellent one, and I agree with it. On the other side of it, there are lots of examples of countries that are using this loophole to basically create a protectionist environment. So we have that's why I say it's more nuanced from our point of view. We have companies that come in with products that literally they're on shelves with no wrapping on them. There's a kind of an extreme between one way or another. This can be used as protectionism. To the extent it's used as protectionism, we have to be very careful of it.
We certainly do, and I'll welcome any further written answer you might have. I want to turn to investor state because there is one that I applaud your answer to the chairman. When he asked the question, who's got our back? The corporate lobby basically wants it to be 3 lawyers operating behind closed doors as much as possible. We know from the Bilcon case that corporate interest went around Canadian law with rights they couldn't have there, and they're only asking for $500 million now because they were denied the right to expand a quarry. I hope you will stand firm for protection of American investors, but not a mechanism that allows them to invade our sovereignty, as you correctly noted, and to subvert and undermine health and safety regulation. There is no reason foreigners should be given more rights than American citizens and American companies have, and that's what's happening through the investor state mechanism. You are right to be skeptical on it, and I hope you will continue to urge that position, because if we don't see some genuine reform of the investor state mechanism, renegotiation of NAFTA will not have met the objectives that you set out initially. Thank you, and I look forward to your further response about this very troubling issue on obesity.
Yeah, I will do
Thank
this,
you.
sir.
Mr. Riker, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you for your time today.
Mr. Chairman, may I just ask unanimous consent to put the Times article into the record, as well as the earlier stories from the Times about Mexico and Chile?
Without objection.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Riker.
That's okay, Mr. Doggett. Ambassador, thank you for being here today, and welcome to Jeffrey and CJ. I look forward to working with all of you and your team. I know that you and I have a few shared priorities, including successfully updating NAFTA and combating unfair trade practices. And as I said, I want to continue to work with you to accomplish both. In doing so, we should build upon our work done during tax reform to boost the competitiveness of American workers and businesses. Even though I'm very appreciative of your, as some has defined, unconventional approach, I still have concerns about several actions that have been taken by the administration that I believe could undermine the good work that we've accomplished through the tax reform effort. To successfully update NAFTA, our farmers and manufacturers require certainty. I know you're keenly aware of that, and accountability. They need to know their investments will be protected and the agreement will be enforced. They need to know that they can rely on this agreement. In targeting unfair trade practices, we must take a targeted approach and work in cooperation with our global partners. We cannot take actions that put our consumers, manufacturers, and exporters at risk. I am deeply troubled by the questions that remain with Section 232 exclusion process and the possibility of tariffs from Section 301 investigation. It is American manufacturers and consumers that will be hurt by an ineffective exclusion process and the placement of tariffs on imports. I implore you to think about my constituents, for example, the family in Maple Valley who will face higher prices, the manufacturer in Auburn who will pay more or lose access to imported parts, and the apple exporter in Wenatchee who will suffer from retaliation. We must also begin to focus on opening markets. As our trading partners move forward without us, our farmers, workers, and businesses fall behind. Whether it's dairy, wine, potatoes, wheat, or tree fruit, Washington's producers will lose market share in their, to their foreign competitors without new trade agreements. Trade agreements ensure Washington's businesses are treated fairly and can sell their high-quality products around the world. I believe the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement is an example of a successful agreement for America and for the state of Washington. I do agree with you, however, that Korea's implementation of the agreement has been disappointing and that any remaining issues related to Korea's implementation need to be resolved quickly. I am glad to see the Chorus committee system being used for this purpose. Of course, the downside to using the joint committee is that there is less transparency surrounding these discussions. Maybe with Jeffrey and CJ's help, we can lend some transparency to the process. So I recommend and would strongly suggest, Mr. Ambassador, that USTR publish detailed negotiating objectives in Chorus to signal to the public the changes that you are seeking within that agreement and those talks. Can you comment on the transparency of the process and maybe providing those detailed negotiating objectives? Do you have a timeline on that?
Well, first of all, I agree that Chorus is an important agreement. On the issue of transparency, I guess I would say since we're not using TPA, we don't have that statutory umbrella. What I've tried to do is, to the extent possible, talk to members, and I'm happy to talk to any members individually or in groups to talk about this. It's not always a good idea to talk openly about negotiating objectives and certainly negotiating tactics. But from the point of view of the United States, we are troubled by implementing a whole variety of implementing issues. We are troubled by the speed with which some tariffs are going to come off on important products in the automotive industry, but also in others. We have issues with currency. We have a variety of issues. I'm happy to talk to members about this. In terms of publishing something, it's probably unlikely that I'm going to do it. My hope is that what we will do is talk privately to members and have some kind of an agreement in principle quickly. My objective is to try to do this as quickly as possible with as little disruption as possible. And it really is why we decided we were better off limiting what we were going to do, not go through the TPA process and overload the system, and just try to work with members and deal with this on a smaller level in a smaller way than a normal big agreement would be. But to the extent members view themselves as not knowing what our specific objectives are, I'm happy to talk to members and look forward to doing that. My hope is this is a process. It comes to a conclusion fairly quickly, because I think it's having negative effects in a lot of different ways.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here this morning and taking our questions and hearing our concerns. Mr. Ambassador, I'm pleased that you acknowledged not only my colleague, Mr. Nunes' issue regarding dairy, but also went on to talk about other agricultural problems, eggs and poultry. And I want to ask you, though, about the U.S. wine exports, because they continue to face some highly burdensome trade barriers in Canada. Canada's discriminatory policy in British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec are restricting market access for American wine and giving Canadian wine producers a real competitive advantage against us. And as you know, you and I have talked about this before, USTR requested WTO dispute settlement consultations with Canada on the British Columbia matter last year, but that really hasn't yielded any resolve or any benefit. And since then, Australia has also launched its own complaint on discriminatory practices affecting Australian wine exports. And in addition to that, we have another agricultural problem with China, and that's our ongoing effort to get exported U.S. rice into the Chinese market. For 10 years, we've been trying to find some equitable resolve to that issue. We've had promise after promise, but still those markets haven't been open to us. So I'd like to know what it is you're doing to make sure that U.S. wine exports are treated fairly in Canada, and what you're doing to make sure that U.S. rice exports are treated fairly in China.
Thank you, Congressman. I would say, first of all, the wine problem is exactly as you say. It's just rank protectionism at the provincial level in Canada, and it's something that, in fact, is spreading. As you say, we brought a WTO case against them. WTO cases take time. We're in the process of aggressively litigating that action. Having said that, we're far better off trying to resolve this issue in the context of a NAFTA negotiation. It's more likely to have a near-term solution that's satisfactory to the industry. So it is something that we are negotiating on. Our hope is, with respect to that, we can see improvement in the NAFTA talks, and that's
other than telling us that you're working on it, are there any specifics? Is there any progress that you can report?
Well, it's one of these issues that, and there are a number of them in this category, that you won't know whether you're making progress until you get to the end. If you look at the kinds of issues, generally it's the tough issues, it's IP issues and it's agriculture issues that are sort of brought together at the end of an agreement, because no one's going to say they're going to do anything in that area. So you go through and you make progress in 30 or 33 chapters. When you get to the ag one, there's just no progress. You talk it through, and the reason is that no one's going to make any concessions there other than as part of a final agreement. Having said that, I believe we will make headway in this area.
How about China and the rice?
Well, on China and rice, we have two WTO cases, as you know, on China and rice. It's another example of both on the subsidy side, but also on the market access side. They're not doing what they, in our judgment, are obligated to do. We're pursuing those, and we'll retaliate. We'll do whatever is required. But I'm not. There are limitations on the WTO process to solve these kinds of issues, and you're seeing it just heads up in the issue of all of those products.
Well, I guess it's certainly frustrating to have been trying to deal with this for quite some time now, and even more frustrating now to hear that we don't know until we fix it. And as I point out, the China problem with the rice has been going on for 10 years. The wine issue has been going on for quite some time, too. And both, in my view, are pretty obvious and pretty blatant violations. And I guess I'd like to hear more about what we can expect. And if things start to go better in your negotiations, if you could let us know, if you could circle back and let me know how that's going, I'd appreciate it. But to date, it just doesn't look like we're making much progress.
On the wine thing, I'm happy to talk to you. On the rice and other WTO issues, that's a difficult process. It's a slow, difficult process, which is seriously flawed.
Thank you. Time has expired. Mr. Roscom, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, just a personal word and then two questions. Personal word is, I appreciate the candor with which you approach things. My wife tells me that the older I'm getting, the more direct I'm becoming, and I find your ability to engage us on these things really refreshing. So you don't have to, I'm not trying to embarrass you, but I just find it refreshing. So two questions. Let me give them both to you, and then if you can just respond, I'd appreciate it. The first is, shifting gears on 232, and press is reporting, and I don't need you to comment whether this is true, but they're saying, well, there's all these criterion by which you're evaluating these country decisions, and they're all rational as far as I can tell. You know, a country's participation in other questions as it relates to trade and so forth. Here's my question. With Ukraine, for example, are you considering the strategic interest of the United States as it relates to changes for Ukrainian steel? Ukraine is in a situation under incredible pressure, incredible duress. It's been a country that's been invaded by Russia. We've got sanctions on Russia. You know the whole story. So is there a national security element to your consideration? That's question number one. Then shifting gears entirely, question number two is, as it relates to catfish, this is not an unfamiliar issue to you. We've got a situation in the United States where there's double evaluation, or, you know, U.S. FDA has a program and Ag has a program. It's pretty ridiculous. And there's a number of us that are trying to correct that. So my question is, can you speak to how the catfish issue in particular has an impact on the negotiations?
Let me say, with respect to the first element I've outlined, and we didn't put it on our website, we find that if we say something to anyone, it's in the paper, so it saves the issue of having to actually type things on your website. Everything becomes public in 5 minutes. We have criteria, and one of the elements, of course, is the national security interests of the United States. So we do have that as an issue. The final criteria is that the president makes that judgment. And that's a kind of a broad decision on his part. He defines national security in the conventional way, but also more broadly as affecting U.S. economic security as part of national security. And you'll see that's a theme that's run through the national security strategy. It's run through our trade agenda. It's run through the entire administration. The national security is defined broadly, and the United States can't defend its allies or itself unless it has a strong economy. So that's something the president has broadened. The issue of the Ukraine specifically, there clearly are national security issues why that would be a consideration. I would say the likelihood at this point right now is that we're starting to defocus more on trade and economic issues once you get below a threshold of national security interests. And of course, it's clear that the Ukraine meets that threshold, but there are a lot of other issues that will probably be more difficult for them to do it. So I guess that answers that. On the question of catfish is a problem in our trade negotiations in some areas. We do have a complicated regulatory process in the United States. We've had cases involving people critical of our system as being basically a protectionist system. On the other hand, we do have a situation where in some other countries there are legitimate health issues. So it's a kind of a complicated issue. It is one that we are familiar with. I would be misleading if I suggested it rose to the level of some of these other things. But to the extent it does for you, then it does for us, and we're happy to work on it. And to the extent we can have an influence on your effort to sort your way through this, to try to clean it up, we're happy to have our people do it and to work with you on it.
Thank you. Mr. Larson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador. Along the same lines, with respect to Section 232 with regard to aluminum tariffs, but perhaps a scene to the eyes of people downstream who are impacted. Now, I represent a district that hails many manufacturers, including Pratt & Whitney, Hamilton Standards, Sikorsky, Kaman, General Dynamics, and throughout the state of Connecticut, precision manufacturers, the downstream, people who will be impacted and have grave concerns about the impending tariffs. One such manufacturer, Jarvis Airfoil, in my district, makes compressor and turbine blades for jet engines, and they were asking me this recently about what can they expect, and here's the questions, and I couldn't agree more with Mr. Roscom about your candor and your ease of going through a number of these issues, but from their perspective, not only is, and I appreciated the national security interest when you talked about what is the criteria for exempting countries, but what is the timeline for exempting countries? And what type of alternative arrangements are you seeking from those countries? And I say that in perspective of this perspective, because do you plan on making these decisions on all the exemptions by the time the tariffs go into effect, which, if I understand it correctly, will be Friday? And so you can imagine the intensified concern that creates about that large supply chain, not to mention, of course, the manufacturers themselves in general. And I'm wondering if you might give us more clarity on that.
Yes, sir. First of all, these matters are a balance in terms of the consumer impact and the producer impact. And this is something the President and the people in administration have tried to balance. In terms of the aluminum generally, it's a pretty clear case that the U.S. industry is under assault and is really close to being completely destroyed. 90% of the primary aluminum is coming into imports. I mean, it's a very, very serious problem, but that's not in any way to minimize the effect it's having on consumers. So in terms of it's what the President tried to do was balance. In terms of the effect, I mean, the timeline, our hope is to get these things resolved by the end of April.
So I'm to assume from that with respect to making decisions on all exemptions by the time tariffs go into effect on Friday would not be the case. You're shooting it for April?
Yeah, that's correct. I would say there'll be two categories of countries, and setting aside your constituent may very well have a product exclusion issue. So setting that, I'm sure he knows that, and he's doing whatever he's going to do, and he may very well not have a problem on that.
I'll submit that to you in writing, and if you can respond on that, I'd appreciate that specific concern. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I would like, and that's important. I want, and that's being done at the Department of Commerce, but we will certainly be a part of the process to the extent it helps your interest. So in terms of the countries, you'll have a certain group of countries, I believe. Now, once again, there's been no decision, and there is no decision until the President makes a decision. As far as I'm concerned, when he signs something, there's a decision. But there are certain countries, the principal examples, of course, of which would be Canada and Mexico, where during the process of this negotiation of trying to decide whether they're going to get out of this, and I should say get out means they can't be in a position where they get out and take advantage of all the benefit. It doesn't go to U.S. producers, so there'll have to be some limitation on their own shipments, but presumably not one that's a problem. During the course of that process, with respect to certain countries, the tariffs will not go into effect That's how I envision it. Now, whether this happens, it's up to the president. But I envision it during the course of this negotiation between now and the end of April that those countries do not see their tariffs go into effect. There are other countries that think they should be excluded, that it will go into effect, and it'll go into effect on Friday. And for those people, there'll be more of a disruption. But in terms of access for your constituent, I don't think you're going to see an enormous shortage of aluminum. Now, once again, I'm not an economist, and we can all make our own guesses, but you're going to have a variety of countries. In the case of aluminum, the very fact you're negotiating with Canada is enormous, right, because they're such an important supplier. And the other countries I also mentioned. Those countries will not see an increase, as I believe this will work out. But with respect to the others, you will see a 10% tariff increase as of Friday.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Time has expired. Mr. Buchanan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Ambassador, for being here today. And I'm excited to see you get some of your team put together. It's been a while, so it's great to have that. Like many of us, I have two situations in our district that I'd like to have you just give some thought to in terms of NAFTA, one good and bad, but I kind of like the chairman. My sense is I want it to be, whatever we do, pro-growth for the United States and jobs. But one is, a company is Tropicana. It was founded in my district in the Manatee County, Bradenton area, creates over 1,000 jobs, was acquired by PepsiCo. But in terms of NAFTA, it's been good for them and good for their industry in terms of eliminating tariffs. So that's one thing I'd like to have you just talk about a little bit. Tropicana, basically, they're, as you know, an orange juice business. You can't imagine Florida without orange juice. And let me just say also, on the second scenario, as you know, we have pretty much the same growing season as Mexico does. So in terms of the second situation, unfair trade practices, a lot of people feel in Florida as it relates to tomatoes, strawberries, and peppers. It's cost that industry, that business, about $2 billion a year, $1 to $3 billion in terms of unfair trade practices. So I'd like to have you take a minute to address both of those as quickly as you can, because I've got one other question.
I'm not very good at the quick part,
yeah,
but I'll try to be quick.
I'll let you know.
First of all, we of course, there's a big advantage one of the principal advantages in NAFTA is the reduction in those tariffs. I'm not sure exactly which tariff we're talking about and what the numbers are, but the reality is if we end up with a successful agreement, the tariff benefit will be preserved. So I think that will probably be less of a problem, and it's more in favor of them saying we want to get NAFTA through, and that's a provision that I'm aware of. The seasonality is provision is an important and significant and controversial provision. So I start with the proposition that with all the great things of sales in Mexico of agricultural products, and there's a lot, whatever there is, 18 or $19 billion worth of sales by the United States in Mexico of agricultural products. The reality is that we have a trade deficit with Mexico on agricultural products. And a good part of that are exactly the ones that you're very familiar with. So the idea is that these producers, even if they're victims of unfair trade, can't take advantage of the unfair trade laws because they really weren't constructed to deal with products that are perishable. So the idea is to put in place some kind of a provision that shrinks the amount of time you look at in terms of calculating dumping margins and injury, so that these products, which if you spread out over a year or over a 3-year on injury, are always going to lose. You give them a shot at proving unfair trade. That's the nature of the proposal. It's extremely controversial with respect to a variety of people who don't like it.
We'll take some time a little bit later and talk a little bit more about that. Let me just hit you quickly on, because you got some of your team here today, your new team, is on TTIP. There was a lot of work that I think, or let's say some work that was being done by the last administration in terms of Europe. And the thought is there, we have a lot of the same values, a lot of the same background. It seems like it makes a lot of sense. That's a real opportunity for America, especially as you look at wages and benefits. There's a lot of comparable things with the United States. and they've been, you know, overall it's been pretty fair both ways. So maybe you could comment on that now that you've got a little bit more of your team in place.
Well, thank you. I will. It is something that we have looked at. Clearly, making headway with Europe is a top priority. We have, with the European Union, a $150 billion trade deficit. After China, it's literally our biggest problem, and it's basically Germany 60, Ireland 38, Italy 30, and France and then 15, and then everyone else we're basically more or less in balance with. So it is a problem. Making headway in that area is very important. It's something we are looking at. They're a little bit in flux right now. But I think making headway on Europe is a high priority. It's clearly something the president wants to do. And whether it's in the form of TTIP, which some people think is more cumbersome than we need, or in another form, your point is one that we completely endorse and think that we have to make headway on that front, and I believe will make headway.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Kind, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for your time here today. Really appreciate it. Just a word of advice. When it comes to chorus renegotiation, or however you want to call it, it's much better to have Congress with you on the takeoff rather than just the landing. And we know that we're getting into sensitive discussions with them, but there's been many businesses in my district that benefited under that agreement too, and they're getting nervous about where the stage of these talks are going. And secondly, I'm all for NAFTA modernization, bringing it into the 21st century. The global economy has changed. I'm all for aggressive enforcement of our trade agreements, 301 or otherwise. What I have a problem with and what I hesitate about is this go-it-alone attitude with this administration and trying to promote a trade agenda by further isolating ourselves. America first does not mean America alone. There's a huge benefit to having friends and allies around the globe that we can work with in order to establish a trading system that works for all of us at the end of the day. And either this president or this administration has conveniently forgotten or maybe never learned the lesson of our preeminence since the Second World War. It's not only our military strength, but it was our willingness to take the lead in shaping a rules-based global trading system with countries across the globe with shared values. And by isolating us and by demonizing many of our friends and allies with a broad scope of retaliatory action, I think makes our trade agenda that much more complicated. I'm worried about the potential for retaliation when it comes to the steel and aluminum tariffs. I think the whole approach to that was ill-considered. It was chaotic. It was confusing. Now we're going on a business-by-business exemption basis, and now we're going to allow some of our friends and allies to apply for exemptions without clearly defined criteria. And I hope this administration is thinking about what Plan B is going to look like if there is retaliatory action taken against us, because back home in my state in Wisconsin, my dairy farmers' backs are up against the wall. If we lose market share down in Mexico, that could destroy our dairy industry in this country overnight because of the #1 export market being taken away from us. That could cause a lot of problems in the heartland of our country. And dealing with steel and aluminum, for every job that is involved in steel or aluminum producing in this country, there are 200 jobs that are involved in consuming this material. And as we learned from the 2002 steel tariff case, which was quickly rolled back under the Bush administration, the unintended consequences can be pretty severe for many workers, for many businesses and industries throughout our country. So I ask you to consider that as we move forward, and including the 301 approach to China and what type of action they could take against us. But what troubles me perhaps more than anything today, sitting here, is this love affair that our president seems to have with Vladimir Putin. And I come to a very fearful conclusion that the president of Russia owns the president of the United States. And that manifested itself in a telephone call yesterday, where the president called to congratulate Vladimir Putin on a completely bogus and fraudulent election, and then failed to even raise the issue of a chemical weapons attack on one of our allies' soils, Great Britain, and failed to raise the issue of Russia direct meddling in our democratic process as a nation. And so it leaves us scratching our head, just what is going on with this president and this administration in our relationship with Russia. We passed enhanced sanctions last year almost unanimously through the House and the Senate, only to see it sat on with the administration for months before any action was taken with it. And that was problematic and very troubling as well. And right now, I couldn't think Vladimir Putin having a better straw man occupying the Oval Office, given all the missed opportunities that this president has passed up when it comes to standing up and defending our values and our strategic interests throughout the globe against Russia, who is not our friend, and they are not our ally. And yet somehow the president misses this important ingredient. So I was just wondering whether you were part of the economic team involved in the application of sanctions against Russia that was passed almost on a unanimous basis last year by this Congress, and why it took so long before any action was taken on it.
Well, thank you, Congressman. Since I only have 18 seconds, I'll just say, with respect to the stuff you're talking about on trade, yes, we're worried about retaliation. Yes, we don't want to go it alone. And with respect to all this Russian stuff, I completely disagree with every single thing you said.
Were you a part of that decision as far as the application of sanctions?
I'm the U.S. trade representative. I do trade work. I don't do sanctions work. It has nothing to do with me at all, not for 5 minutes in my entire life. But I appreciate you bringing it up.
Okay, thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your time here today as we have very important discussions, whether it's NAFTA, whether it's KORUS, whether it's various trade issues that we know are important to American producers, particularly Nebraska ag producers. That is my focus, but we know that consumers live in every one of our districts, obviously, and we always want to be mindful of that. As it does relate to agriculture, certainly I've expressed to you and I've expressed to the President as well, as that as we modernize our trade agreements, certainly I appreciate that. If we could also obviously do no harm to those areas we have done particularly well with, namely agriculture. Energy has been discussed as well. 45% of Nebraska's agriculture exports go to Canada and Mexico, so it's no surprise that NAFTA is important as we do move forward. And I just continue to strongly urge you to keep this in mind of how important these exports are, especially as I can appreciate the need to close the gap, the trade gaps that do exist. One thing, agriculture exports do help us on narrowing those gaps, and I hope that we can continue to expand our international reach and expand international markets for agriculture. Briefly, the President touched on the possibility of re-engaging the countries in TPP. I have two questions. That would be one of them, is if you could elaborate perhaps or reflect on the potential of re-engaging a TPP that, as you know, has moved forward without the United States. And then also the President has touched on the bilateral trade agreements that he would like to pursue perhaps, and if you could also reflect on that and how we might be able to utilize that moving forward, whether it's with Japan or other countries that we would like to see more exports of U.S. products heading in those directions. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Congressman. First of all, we appreciate your intervention on this issue of the importance of agriculture. We completely agree with it. Not only have you raised it repeatedly here, but in all other contexts, and it's very important. It's very important to us, both in terms of the consequences of our other action on agriculture, but more importantly, probably using the trade agenda to promote agriculture. So we sit back and we talk about the fact that we have whatever it is, $140 billion worth of agricultural sales. In most of the markets we go into, we could sell vastly more. And we're really facing protectionism. And I mean, Europe is a good example. China is a good example. There's enormous, enormous opportunity. And a lot of the things that we designed with that in mind. So agriculture is important. It's crazy to sit back and be defensive in agriculture, however, because the reality is we're being stopped in a lot of places from just local political pressure creating protectionism. On the issue of TPP, I guess I would say the following. So it's complicated to get in and renegotiate that. But if you analyze TPP, you have 11 countries in TPP. With respect to 6 of them, right now, we already have a free trade agreement. So the idea of upgrading that and getting those in a position where you think that what you want is fine. With respect to the other 5, by far the most important is Japan, which we've already raised. So I don't know what the total amount is. Japan is maybe a $5 trillion economy. I'd bet all the rest of them together weren't $1 trillion, because the next biggest one is Malaysia, which is just over $300 billion, and then Vietnam is the next one after that. So I'm saying of the 5, if you got an agreement with Japan, you've essentially solved the whole problem. Certainly if you got one with Japan, Vietnam, which some people have suggested, or Malaysia, you've basically taken care of 95% of what's outside of the U.S. ambit right now that's in the TPP sphere. So I think when people think about TPP, sometimes they think of it as something that we're not a part of. We already have FTAs with 6 of these countries, and not to say that they can't be improved, and they should be improved. But the way I analyze it, I say, number one, you have a problem because you want to work it out with Japan, because they're by far the biggest, the 3rd biggest economy in the world, and by far the biggest of those. And then somebody's got to sit down and decide, do you allocate resources to Malaysia, or do you allocate resources to Vietnam? And there are reasons for that. You can argue all of them, and our view is that that's the job this deputy has to do. We have to come to grips with that. The Japan is clear, but the next tier, we have to come to grips with that, and we have to get the opinion of this committee.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Pascrell, just a reminder, after your questioning, we'll go to 2 to 1 so we can balance out the rest of the hearing.
I'm sorry?
After your questioning, we'll move to 2 to 1 so we can balance this out. Mr. Pascrell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I think it's clear after Montreal and Mexico City, and thank you for your indulgences up there, that we're approaching, I think, a culminating part of the negotiations. That's my judgment. We have a lot of tough issues to address. And I quickly went through the document that we're supposed to be talking about today. Part of it is NAFTA. Some of your NAFTA proposals have really challenged the status quo of U.S. trade policy, and I think have been creative in trying to make the agreement work for the many and not just the few. All the boats have to rise. And I have confidence still that you are working to ensure the labor chapter of NAFTA is fully enforceable, building on the strength of the May 10th agreement as a floor and not a ceiling. And I want you to interrupt me if I say something that is not in place. Please feel free to do that. Enforceable labor standards alone will not entirely solve the key driver of outsourcing under NAFTA. We all know that. For 25 years, Mexico has engaged in a purposeful strategy of labor and wage suppression in order to attract investment at the expense of the U.S. and the expense of Canadian workers, and in ways that have expanded poverty for Mexican families instead. The record is clear on this. The numbers are clear. Building a middle-class market for the U.S. exports. You identified in the Trade Agenda report, you said this: since NAFTA went into effect, the gap in Mexican wages and labor productivity with the United States has widened. The OECD, the organization that we know about for many years, reports that the average annual wage in Mexico fell from $16,008 in 1994 to $15,311 in 2016, unquote. I met with the workers in Mexico City just a few weeks ago because reading about it and looking at statistics is very different than hearing anecdotal stories about actual situations that are tangible. And no Democrat and no Republican can deny these. They were in the auto parts factory, many of them, and were making less than $1 an hour. No options to bargain for better treatment. Both the labor rules in NAFTA and in Mexico, Mexico's own labor law and practice, must be upgraded to make real changes for workers both in Mexico and my district. Do you agree that Mexico has failed to live up to its obligations with respect to NAFTA's labor side agreement? Yes or no?
Yes.
So please explain how USTR is working to solve the problem of low wages and so-called protection unions, which you've identified yourself, not I, you, in Mexico, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. How are we working to get this done? Explain.
I would say, first of all, that while wages have been stagnant, and that was not our expectation at all when we entered into this agreement. If you look at the way it was clearly sold as wages go up in Mexico. They became customers for us. We get to sell a lot more stuff, and that has not happened. I would say from the point of view of the Mexicans, it has created a lot of jobs, though. Low-income jobs, in our opinion, but a lot of jobs. And a lot of those have been in the auto industry. And I would suggest many of those at the expense of U.S. jobs.
And that's important, isn't it, Mr. Ambassador, to understand the relationship between how low wages, I'm putting it as simple as possible, in Mexico do affect jobs. And can I at least finish what I'm saying?
I'm sorry, Mr. Pascal, all time has expired. But maybe another member can yield to you at a future.
I don't want anyone to yield. I'm asking you a question. Can I finish my question?
I'm sorry, Mr. Pascal.
Well, you know what?
Continue
That
with the time
stinks.
limit. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here. I want to reiterate my support for the continuation of strong investor protections like investor-state dispute settlement in NAFTA, and I've grown concerned about reports to weaken, remove, or make protections optional. ISDS ensures the U.S. investors in foreign countries benefit from the same process and due compensation rights that foreign investors enjoy in the U.S. under our Constitution. That sounds a lot like the reciprocity and trade deals that this administration wants. Foreign investment by U.S. companies also creates and supports U.S. jobs. For example, the family farm and ranch operations in my district who depend on exporting their products to Mexico utilize Kansas City Southern's railroad to provide that vital link to reach these crucial markets. This cross-border infrastructure would not be possible without the $4.5 billion in Kansas City Southern invested in Mexico over the past 20 years. Additionally, when the House and the Senate last passed Trade Promotion Authority, it established ISDS as a negotiating objective. So not including ISDS in NAFTA would be a direct rebuke to Congress's explicit direction and could undermine critical support for a renegotiated NAFTA lacking such protections. Ambassador Lighthizer, I urge you to reconsider your position on ISDS. Continuing to include ISDS in NAFTA makes both good policy and political sense. And to speak just a little more broadly, Ambassador Lighthizer, I can't overstate the importance of NAFTA for the farmers, ranchers, and manufacturers in my district. In fact, about 24 County Farm Bureau members from eastern Kansas were just in my office yesterday to hammer this point home. They depend and rely on being able to sell to Mexico and Canada as though their livelihoods depend upon it, because they do. The message I received is the need for certainty that NAFTA benefits, which have allowed Kansas exports to surge, remain in place. This certainty is paramount paramount to providing desperately needed assurance to all aspects of the Kansas economy. The small towns across my district that make up America's agriculture heartland are depending on the administration getting this modernization right and moving on to expanding into new markets and joining new trade deals. That's why I strongly support NAFTA and why I encourage this administration to follow through on its promise of doing no harm. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jenkins. Mr. Paulson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here and also for your work and progress on the NAFTA renegotiations, particularly in the area of regulatory practices, anti-corruption issues, customs issues, and digital trade. Modernizing NAFTA with the digital chapter is essential, not only to protecting American innovation, but also access to markets through e-commerce that many of our American products and services are sold from. But I got to tell you, the President's decision to invoke a very little-used 1962 law to impose these broad tariffs is creating a lot of uncertainty, and it does threaten to derail some of the economic gains and benefits that we have seen recently in our economy. And it seems like every time now that I speak to a Minnesota company, they have a lot of questions about some of this uncertainty, of the current trade climate that we have. Now, they usually begin the conversation by talking about the real economic benefits that they have seen, already seeing right now from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And they tell me how they're investing more in new equipment, they're reinvesting in their employees, and that's a good thing. But then they also will talk about some of the bad news regarding the new tariffs and maybe pulling the threat to pull out of NAFTA, for instance. And there was one Fortune 500 company in Minnesota recently that produces engines and generators. They said that half of their economic benefit made by tax reform will be wiped out by the steel and aluminum tariffs that are being imposed. And it's not just large employers that are being impacted or putting these projects on hold now. We have small manufacturers and small businesses like R&M Manufacturing that shared their thoughts with me directly, saying they're opposed to the steel and aluminum tariffs that are under Section 232, saying it would be disastrous for them as well as other small metal-forming companies, because raising their prices means they're going to no longer be competitive, and they're going to get clobbered. And so I support the President's objective and your objective of really fighting for the American worker that needs that support and helping employees of U.S. steel companies. But some of those gains are going to be swamped by some of the larger losses that could be felt by much larger losses at metal-consuming companies and other areas across the economy if we have those retaliation tariffs. And economists now are saying with the trade partnership, for instance, the study says the United States would lose 5 jobs for every job created in steel and aluminum savings. And that's without retaliatory tariffs. If you take in retaliation, it could be a net loss of 18 jobs for every job gain. And it's not even close. That's 470,000 jobs. And most of those jobs are production, they're blue collar, they're exactly the type of jobs that I think you and the President are intent on protecting. And then I think we're on pins and needles with the upcoming potential announcement later this week because retailers like Best Buy in Minnesota are concerned about the upcoming Section 301 tariffs. And I'm all for targeting Chinese intellectual property violations, holding them accountable, but let's be targeted in what we want China to change, and let's go after that, because consumer electronics don't have domestic production. And I hope we won't be seeing tariffs imposed on products that a lot of American families and consumers and small businesses purchase every day. It wouldn't make sense to raise the cost of a laptop for a college student or a couple $100 on a computer for a small business, for instance. And I would say, how is that going to help change the Chinese minds? And I know in Minnesota we've got 800,000 jobs now that rely on trade. It's one of the reasons that we weathered the economic storm a lot better than most states. We have a lot of high-valued manufacturing. And those jobs, by the way, they pay a lot higher than average salaries. And so let's just not shoot ourselves in the foot. I don't believe any country wins a trade war. I think all countries lose. And Mr. Ambassador, I think every one of the companies I highlighted and I've heard from, they share the exact same goal that you have to change China's behavior. And I just want to ask, would you be willing to meet with some key industry leaders or make some folks are sitting down and we continue to work together on solutions that are really going to be effective in that capacity? And I'll ask some more follow-up targeted questions that are more specific in the written record, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, there's a lot there. First of all, with respect to that trade partnership study, I haven't looked at this one particularly. I've looked at those in the past, and the accuracy of them is so slow that I wouldn't let it keep me awake at night. That is not to say that the basic point that we have to balance downstream effects is very important, and we understand that. Nobody wins from a trade war. We certainly don't want a trade war. On the other hand, you have to ask yourself, can we go on with a 800 and growing billion-dollar trade deficit? There's only a handful of countries in the whole world that have a GDP the size of that. So we have to do something. And the people who are benefiting from the status quo are always going to be against it. And we understand that, and we have to balance their interests. But the reality is, if you're on a course that is unsustainable, you have to figure out something to change. So, am I willing to sit down and meet with business people? I'm happy to do that. And I would say I and my deputies do it every day. We've had an enormous amount of contact with business people, and I think it's an extremely important part of what we do.
Thank you, Mr. Master.
Thank you, gentlemen's time has expired. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lighthouse, what is your view of the U.S. trade relationship with Canada? Does the United States have a trade deficit or a trade surplus in your view?
One of the great questions of all times. So this is something on which I have spoken about for years. So here's the situation. Numbers are all confusing, and when I'm finished, it will be appropriate to ask, if you're not confused, then you're not paying attention, all right? So quickly. You will be confused.
Quickly,
so,
I only have 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, but you can't ask a 2-hour question in 10 minutes. I'll give you the shortest version of it. The fact is that if you look at goods on a custom basis, yes, we have a $17 billion deficit with Canada. If you look at customs basis, what does Canada say their surplus is, which should be the contrary?
Right.
That turns out to be $97 billion. So Canada thinks on a customs basis they have a $97 billion surplus with us. Where's the number? It's somewhere in between. And what's the cause? The cause is a lot of things, but the biggest one is it's products that come into the United States, go up to Canada. We count them as, in many cases, we count them as a U.S. export, even though they're not U.S. exports. If they're duty-free, they can just be trucked up there and have nothing. The Canadians, however, would look upon it as an import from the appropriate country. Now, if you look at it on a balance of payments basis, then the numbers are different. And if you look at it on a customs basis for goods only at 17, and then people sometimes will say, what's the services surplus? Because we do have a services surplus, but on a customs basis, there is no services number. So you have to take a services number from another data set. And if you do that and you use our number, then we have a small surplus. If you use that and use their number, we still have an enormous deficit.
Okay. Has the strong-arm tactics of the president as it relates to tariff threats, have they helped or hurt the negotiations?
Well, and first of all, I don't buy your premise. I don't think there's been any strong-arm tactics. I'm interested to know what you're
specifically I'm referring to tariff threats. In other words, the president, in published reports, has stated that he's issuing tariff threats against China or against Canada and Mexico as leverage to get a better deal in NAFTA negotiations. It's pretty simple. It's been...
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying, does the 232 affect the negotiation?
No, I'm saying, does the strong-arm tactics of the president threatening tariff threats help or hurt in the negotiations? It's a very simple question.
Well, then the answer is I've seen no strong-arm tactics, so they've had no effect on negotiations.
Okay. 93% of the heroin seized by the United States Drug Enforcement Agency came from Canada, or from Mexico. 81 metric tons of heroin today. The president has demanded that Mexico do more to prevent drugs from entering the United States as a condition for lifting steel and aluminum tariffs. Is that something that has found its way into the negotiation?
Well, In the first place, there's a lot going on between the United States and Mexico to try to deal with the heroin problem. It is a legitimate problem on which no one can disagree. And there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's not something that I've been in slightest bit involved with, but I know what's going on, and so I sort of hear about a lot of important stuff, and I think it will make a significant difference.
So there's discussion going on. I have a final question, because this is important. What, in your opinion, optimally and realistically will be, in the renewed NAFTA discussion, outcome, final agreement, what will it look like as it relates to net benefits to the United States? Specifically, name 3 net new provisions that will benefit American workers.
Well, I mean, there are so many of them, some of which would be controversial, so I won't mention them. But clearly, rules of origin would be an enormous increase in benefit to the United States. The IP provisions are going to be an enormous and just unarguable benefit to the United States. There's huge improvements will be made in digital trade, which will be extremely important to the United States. And I could literally go down. There's services trade. We have 33 chapters. And of all those chapters, I personally don't think there's a single one that won't be a significant improvement from the United States. And I would say that of the 33, the members here would agree that 90% of them are huge improvements for the United States, assuming we get an agreement. But yes, I think it's a very powerful, very, very important improvement in a whole variety of areas.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Marchant, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today, Ambassador. My district is in Texas, North Texas. It's the home of the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. So our area basically is involved more in the administration, distribution, marketing, storage of NAFTA goods and services more than the production of the actual product. And that has created just a boomtown type economy in Dallas. And so my home builders have come to me since we gained 90,000 jobs last year. It has put a lot of pressure on our home building and our apartment building and our whole building community. So they're concerned because of the tariffs that are involved in lumber, mainly with Canada, I think, and have provided me with charts that show that the lumber prices have escalated 40 to 60% in just the last year. And I would like to just have a discussion with you about maybe just the purpose of the tariffs. Are they serving the purpose? Is there some relief in sight? Is the NAFTA agreement going to address these tariffs, or are they separate? And just a general information for my home builders back home.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Congressman. So if we're talking about the softwood lumber tariffs between the United States and Canada, those are the result. Sometimes people talk about those as if there's some kind of administration policy. There's no administration policy on this other than the policy that everyone here believes, which is that you have to enforce your laws against unfair trade. So you have affected U.S. companies who bring cases. They get duties. They go through and prove that what the nature, the level of the dumping and subsidies are. Then they go and they prove that they've been injured at the ITC. Then they get orders put into effect. And that's the process that's gone on, and it will go on. And then in the past, and to some extent ongoing, there's an effort to try to get the U.S. industry to give up their rights under those in exchange for some kind of a package or something that'll sort of smooth things out. And that's a process which goes on every now and then. In the past, there have been a number of memorandums of understanding, numbers of attempts to kind of work this out that have worked it out. Right now, I would say there's probably not much going on. And in terms of those negotiations, are they part of NAFTA? Not as far as I'm concerned, they're not part of NAFTA. As far as I'm concerned, this is a function of the the trade laws working the way Congress designed them to work, and that when this happens, sometimes prices go up, and sometimes it's unfair to people, and sometimes it's just the fact is they were just taking advantage of an unfair situation before and making money on low prices. So, and I don't know which it is in this case, but they could both be a factor. But to me, it's unlikely, I think, I wouldn't put it at zero, but it's unlikely that I'm going to end up solving this issue or trying to resolve this issue. Right now, the positions are kind of intractable, and the people that brought the litigation have the right, just like anyone else here and any of your constituents are who bring a case and win it, have the right to get the benefit of the lawsuit.
Okay, I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Ms. Black, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here today. My district and my state of Tennessee has really benefited greatly from NAFTA because it has helped to bring some of the large-scale manufacturing automobiles to the state of Tennessee. It's quite an operation there across our entire state. These operations are tremendously important to our communities, especially one right there in the middle of Tennessee, Smyrna, which is the home of the Nissan plant that produces more than 150,000 automobiles in that plant annually. So it's a big issue for that Middle Tennessee area. There's been considerable press regarding UTSR's auto rule of origin proposal, which, if the press reports are accurate, appears to be wholly unworkable for the industry and could have some perverse effect of costing American jobs rather than creating them, which again is a real concern for us there in Middle Tennessee in particular. I understand that Canada presented a framework of ideas as a counterproposal during round 6 in Montreal, but that Canada's proposal could result in less regional content than we have now. So can you update us on whether Canada has been able to provide additional details regarding their proposal, or whether Mexico has provided its own proposal on the auto's rules of origin? Because it is really critical for our communities like Smyrna, and we need to get it right.
Thank you, Mrs. Black. I would say this, first of all, the auto plants, particularly these, what we used to call transplants, coming to Tennessee and other places has been an enormous boon and very important not only for Tennessee but for the country. So I think we have to acknowledge that, number one. Number two, the rules of origin will have no effect on cars made in Tennessee and sold in the United States, right? They're kind of irrelevant to that whole equation. They'll have no effect on them at all. What Nissan was worried about is that Nissan would say, I have a plant in Mexico that wants also to sell in the U.S., and that plant, in fact, has very, very little U.S. content. So that plant has a problem. But it'll have no effect on anybody working in Tennessee for a Nissan plant for any cars sold in the United States. So I want to make that point because sometimes when they go around and talk about this, they kind of conflate those two things, and they're completely separate. In terms of our working, we're working with the industry very closely on rules of origin. We want to be in a position where more of these jobs that are in Mexico right now come back to the United States. The basic model that Mexico has had, and there's been reference to it over here, they have it's a smart model from their point of view. They want to lure companies to come to Mexico to make cars and sell them in the United States. Take advantage of their low wages, but take advantage of other things too, like subsidies and like duty drawbacks and the like. So that's a strategy which is smart for Mexico. It's not necessarily a strategy that's smart for the United States. So our objective is to have more content, U.S. content, but even really Canadian content. The idea is it shouldn't just be a model where you come in, you're subsidized, you make stuff in in Mexico and sell it to 80% to the United States. That's not a very good model from our point of view. So our objective is to try to find the line where we can encourage them to move some of that production parts, cars, but also parts back to the United States. And we're in the process of talking to the companies and trying to do that. And our hope is that we get something that at least some of the large manufacturers will find useful. With respect to others, I suspect they're going to be in a position where any change is going to move them to the point where they'll have to pay the 2.5% tariff. But none of those will be manufactured, will involve companies, workers who are in Tennessee or in the United States. So I want to just make that clear. But if we're going to improve the situation in NAFTA, we have to get rules of origin to get more jobs to come back to the United States. Will they all come back? No, of course not, not a chance. But a lot of them can come back, and that's our objective. And the Canadians, to be honest, have a similar objective. They also have been seeing a diminution in their auto industry, and they have a similar objective. And the Mexicans are in a position where they have to balance.
Thank you.
But we are trying to work our way through that.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for joining us. I want to spend my time, limited time, focusing on the current U.S.-South Korea trade agreement renegotiations. As you know, auto manufacturing is critical in Alabama's economy. I have a Hyundai plant in my district that employs 3,000 workers and provides many of my constituents with high-paying jobs. Therefore, the U.S.-Korean relationship is very important to Alabamians and especially to the 7th Congressional District. I understand that this administration has concerns about the implementation of the original agreement, and I can appreciate those concerns. I, like many of my colleagues who have spoken earlier, really just want to reemphasize the importance of transparency. I share with my colleagues the concerns about lack of transparency in this renegotiation process. And my question really is, as I understand it, the reason why I would assume that you're invoking TPA for NAFTA but not doing so for the KORS agreement, you've stated was because there were only minor amendments. And I guess I'm questioning the unilateral decision that the executive branch can make as to, to keeping the legislative branches and members of Congress out of the loop. Can you talk a little bit about, your ability to not come before us for TPA on KORS?
Sure, and that's an excellent question. The bottom line is that TPA creates a process that has a number of steps. The Congress is involved, as are cleared advisors and the like, and it takes more than a year to do, realistically. And in fact, probably a lot more than a year. So if you're in a negotiation like we have with KORS, you're in a position where there is a real price to the uncertainty of waiting for the negotiations to go forward.
Well, I appreciate it takes a lot of time, obviously, to go through the TPA process. I really was questioning what the ability of this administration or any executive to actually make that decision versus, coming before Congress and asking for our blessings on this renegotiation.
Sure. So there's an amendment process within the agreement. And to the extent you follow the amendment process within the agreement, there are certain things you can do and certain things that you can't do. Things that require changes of law, for example, you probably cannot do. And that's why you would almost, in that circumstance, say, okay, fine, we're going to have to go to TPA. But there are a number of things that you can change. You can speed up tariffs. There's a whole variety of things you can do. And it was, I would suggest, contemplated by Congress when they passed the law implementing that agreement, but also similar agreements. It was contemplated that this process could be used for certain things and not for other things. So
well,
we're in
I just want to reclaim a little. I'm running out of time. I wanted to reclaim my time. I just really wanted to reiterate what you've heard from lots of my colleagues, that this agreement, the KORS renegotiation, is just as important as NAFTA, and there are lots of members of Congress who will be directly impacted by any changes in that agreement, like my district, and we obviously would want to be kept abreast and in the loop as to the changes that are going to be made, and asked our consideration as to how it will affect our districts. The other thing I wanted to discuss is this administration has shown a link between national security and trade, and I also sit on the Intelligence Committee, and I see the threats that this country faces every day. I also have commerce, have seen how commerce can foster international cooperation and bolster national security. So I agree that the trade and national security are linked, but President Trump recently alluded to the possibility of pulling out American troops out of South Korea if South Korea doesn't give into our demands on the Korean negotiations. I just want to make sure that, and know your thoughts about how it is we can threaten strategic allies in the process of this renegotiation. I think that there's a balance, sir, that must be maintained when we are renegotiating with our strategic allies, and threats like that I don't think help. Your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, we're in the process of doing a lot of things. We certainly agree with you that South Korea is a very important ally, and they're not only an important ally, but an important ally at a particular spot right now where there's a great deal of vulnerability. And in terms of my negotiations with my counterpart on the Korean U.S. agreement, troops and the like have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I don't get involved with it at all. Now, there are other people who would say that in other parts of the strategic relationship from the point of the United States that worry about who's paying for what and all these kinds of things. And I know there's a whole world of stuff there that's very important and somebody has to sort out. And it's
Mr. Ambassador, I apologize. The time has expired.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for being here. And I'm glad your team's starting to get filled out. I know you've been doing yeoman's work on this. Look, you know where I'm from in Western Pennsylvania, and I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can because I know there's others waiting to talk. But there, at one time, steel and aluminum were such a big part of that area. And now we have our mills are shuttered, the towns are decimated. And I think the president's talking about putting tariffs on aluminum and steel has been a big boost to the folks that live there, give them hope again, because for so many years people talked about it. And if you can repeat, just so, what's the trade imbalance right now? Because I think people talk about us getting into a trade war, and the imbalance right now is it what, $800 billion? So I guess that's considered a skirmish, not really a war.
$800 billion is the goods number.
All right.
The goods and services number is like 565 or some number quite like that.
Well, we're in a real battle right now to maintain our jobs. One of the things I understand, you're going to be leading the country exemption process for the president. And it's been reported that there will be roughly 5 criteria for granting tariff exemptions for countries related to fighting overcapacity, blocking dump steel from its market, participating in the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity, and supporting anti-dumping and countervailing duty disputes lodged by the U.S. at the WTO. One of the things I want to bring up, one of the companies in the district that I represent is a company called NLMK. They're in Farrell, Pennsylvania. They have 600 people that work at the Farrell plant, and down in Sharon they have another 150. And I think they're pretty much on board with what's going on with the tariffs. But they're a Russian-owned company, and I know this disturbs so many people. Anytime the word Russia comes up, we go running around with our hair on fire. What they're feeling is that any of these tariffs should be applied to overseas companies that have been dumping steel or manipulating currency for years. And one of the men up there who represents the steel workers, Terry Day, has said that let's go after the people that have been the bad actors. They get the Russian steel in, but then they reheat it, then they roll it out, they make coils with it. I think that some people put everybody in the same category, so I just want to make sure that when we go after these folks and the exclusions that are granted, there are some people that do have a model already in place. They have not been taking advantage of a bad trade situation, but they've actually, in fact, worked to get through it. These are, by the way, American workers that are actually producing this product. So if you can you just give me an idea on how the country exemption discussions are proceeding at this point, and how would a company like MLK and the rest of the forging companies, because we have a lot of forging companies too in Pennsylvania that are looking at all this, so how that would work out, and how they would or would they not be included in the exclusions, and how would it work?
Well, let me say, first of all, that there are 2 levels of exclusion, right? There are product exclusions, and I don't know if in their case they have a product coming in that's somehow unique in a way that it doesn't reduce the efficiency of the program. So there will be a number of countries, and when we've done this in the past, because I've been around this before, there's always a process where somebody comes in and says this is a unique process and a unique product, and that product should be excluded. So there is that. With respect to the countries, I would say there is a cognizance on our part that some countries are bigger contributors to the problem than others, and a number of people believe that Russia is in that group of countries that are contributors. So if you look at when this was originally set up, you had option 1, which was 25% across the board. You had option 2, which picked out 12 countries, and those countries would have gotten higher duties, but others would not. So that's the options, the president with option number 1. With respect to option number 2, one of the countries that was viewed to be a significant contributor to the problem was Russia. So I'm not exactly sure that in all cases people would say they're basically operating in clean hands. That's not to say that in your situation it's necessarily reflective of that. So what these countries tended to be were people that imported product from China and exported product to the United States. So you even had places like with Costa Rica, you had places you think, what? Where does that come from? And the presumption was that they were taking in steel from China and shipping either that or their own steel and replacing it to the United States. So I would suggest that Russia is, at least in the opinion of some people, is a problem. I would say, and there's a number of others who I could go through, I would say that there is an effort made to try to separate out these things. I don't think you're going to see a lot of exclusions done in any event, but I would say this, that to the extent exclusions are offered and product exclusions come in, it does have a dampening effect in terms of the effect on prices in the product, which would have a dampening effect on any negative consequences that go down the road.
Time has expired. Mr. Renacci, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Lighthizer, from one Ohio to another, thank you for being here. Ashtabula says hello, and thank you for your testimony. I'd like to tell you about 2 Ohio farmers I've recently spoken to, Jerry Bambauer and Dave Daughter. Jerry and his son farm nearly 900 acres in Auglaize County, Ohio. He's the 3rd generation of his family to farm the land and hopes his grandson eventually steps up to be the 5th generation farming the land. His family started with only 8 acres back in the 1930s. Through hard work and dedication, the farm eventually grew to its current size. The main crop farmed on this land is soybeans. Jerry's friend, Dave Daughter, lives over in Wayne County, which is in my district, and also farms soybeans. Dave grew up on a dairy farm but didn't really care for milking cows as much as his older brother. He knew he wanted to farm land and wanted to own his land, so he made it happen. He eventually purchased 1,100 acres that he farms with his son. His current focus is on building up the farm a bit further before he passes along to his son. I'm telling you about Dave and Jerry because both of these men personally identify the American dream that many farmers in Ohio can relate to. But I'm also telling you about them so you're aware of their concerns. As you know, U.S. soybean farmers are very concerned about recent suggestions from China that it may target soybeans if trade disputes escalate. Given that the U.S. is one of the world's largest exporters of soy, and China is one of the largest importers of soy, their concerns are valid, especially since Ohio is the 9th largest producer of soybeans in the United States. So my questions for you, Ambassador, are threefold. First, in your conversations with other countries, how are you addressing the devastating effect that these types of retaliatory measures could have on the U.S. farmers? Also, what steps might the U.S. take to prevent this potential issue from becoming a real problem? And finally, is there any message you would like to relay to all the concerned soybean farmers back in Ohio?
Well, thank you, Congressman. First of all, we're very much aware of the problem, and I made this point from the beginning, not only in the context of the steel and aluminum, but in the context of anything we do with China. We clearly have a problem with China. We're clearly going to have to do something to stick up for our own interests and to prevent ourselves from further seeing our national wealth eroded. And when they do, one of the first things they always talk about, and what we always think about, is $14 billion worth of soybean sales. They're by far our biggest market. And if you look at what they import, even among agricultural products, it's sort of like 14, and then the next 14 billion, and the next falls down to about 1.5 billion. I mean, it's an enormous spike. It's extremely important, and it is a real vulnerability. I would say also that even without any of this going on right now, the Chinese are cutting back. They're limiting their soybean imports, having nothing to do with any of this. They're doing it for their own reasons because they find that there are advantages to Brazilian soybeans, and they have their own bureaucracy doing whatever it's going to do. So it is a major concern. It's something that we worry about. I'd say I'm focusing on soybeans because you brought it up, but it's all agricultural products are vulnerable in this kind of a circumstance. So it's something we have to be very, very cognizant of as we take any steps. I don't think it's a sufficient worry that you would say, therefore, we're not going to stand up for American intellectual property or do the kinds of things that we have to do. But we're trying to do everything in a measured, appropriate, and measured way. And if there is retaliation, then the United States is going to have to take action to stick up for our farmers, because we can't be in a position where when we do something that's not crazy or radical but is necessary to keep the United States economy going, that somebody threatens farmers and therefore you don't do it, right? We can't have a $375 billion trade deficit and not do anything to defend ourselves. But I think it's extremely important that we're aware of it and that we have to be prepared, working with Congress and others, to take countermeasures if it turns out that they are acting unfairly with respect to or retaliating against us with respect to soybeans, but also other agricultural products and other products too, but you generally tend to focus on agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Jim, and yields back. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized. Excuse me, Ms. Delbene, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for joining us today. Digital trade is an important part of our trade agenda and should be a major focus area as we look to modernize our trade agreements. But digital trade is also making trade work for Americans across the country. We know that many small sellers, constituents in my district, but across the country, are harnessing the power of the internet to reach customers abroad in ways that were really impossible a decade ago. In 2015, the U.S. led an effort to expand the Information Technology Agreement, and 53 countries, including China, agreed to remove 201 tariffs on information and communications technologies, ICT products. Products like next-generation semiconductors that are manufactured in America and used in products around the world. So your trade agenda acknowledges the importance of digital trade. However, the foundation of a strong and a vibrant digital economy includes access to affordable ICT products, such as smartphones and tablets. The biggest beneficiaries of low tariffs on ICT products are our students, entrepreneurs, and small businesses who use these devices to innovate and to sell their goods and services around the world. So recent press reports, as we have discussed today, indicate the administration is considering a $60 billion tariff package on consumer products, including consumer electronics from China, as part of the Section 301 investigations enforcement actions. And so I wondered if you could explain for us how these tariffs would help make it easier for our businesses and entrepreneurs around the country to compete in a global economy.
So I guess the question is, will the 301, because we're not putting tariffs on for any reason other than the assault on the U.S. information technology industry. So we have an issue that China has a policy of, one, forcing technology transfer in the case of inward-bound investment, two, forcing companies to license technology at less than the economic value of it, three, state subsidizing and directing massive amounts, and I think in some of these sectors, $300 billion worth of investment to take over U.S. technology firms, and then four, the absolute theft of technology through cyber theft. So those are kind of the premises of the reason that we've launched the 301. Now, the question is, if you go through this, you have the study, and you decide there's a serious problem there, the issue then is, what do you do? One of the things that you would do is impose tariffs. The way you would impose the tariffs, and I tried to allude this at the beginning, is there are certain technology products that are under assault. You have to give consideration to whether or not you would put tariffs on those products. Another issue is you would create an algorithm that would maximize the pressure on China and minimize the pressure on U.S. consumers. And the combination of those two would be the way you would get to the amount you have. So you come up with the economist study and say, here's a measured amount of what the relief should be, and then you try to find a system that allows you to impose it in a way that's most rational. And if the president makes the decision to do this, and he hasn't not made that decision, we haven't done anything, but it is imminent that he'll come to the decision, that's the way we're going to approach it. So you say, how does U.S. technology, my view, this whole system vastly benefits U.S. technology companies, vastly, because it protects their intellectual property, which is the very heart of what they are. There's no sector
Excuse me,
in
just
America.
before we run out of time, are you saying then that you are taking into an account in any enforcement action that you take that the impact it would have on consumers, the impact it would have on small sellers across the country, and on innovation and entrepreneurs across our country?
Yes, we certainly have a logarithm that tries to minimize the negative effect on us and maximize it on them. It's a logarithm that's created, and it's the kind of thing that you would expect us to do. And if we do this, that's the kind of thing we will do. So for sure, that's right.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Meehan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Lighthizer, for being here today and for all of your continuing work in this space. I want to, for the record, have an opportunity to express an issue. I know we've talked about it, but I represent a district in which QVC is a business which it broadcasts around the country and is able to take advantage of sales of goods. Canada prevents that broadcast from going across the borders using something called a cultural exemption. And it is not clear to me that the basis upon which they claim a culture exemption would apply to something like this. It looks really more like a way in which they're effectively preventing what we would hope would be the fair competition, working to the distinct disadvantage of QVC. I know that you've got a lot of big issues with NAFTA, but I hope when we get to the crossing the T's and I's that something important like this is an issue that is also on the negotiating table, that and the idea the products, small people that have small products, there's a cost associated with moving goods into Canada for the small producer. Somebody in the same way may have a knick-knack that they're selling in Canada, but there's exclusions on getting those things in there. I hope those kinds of things will be part of the negotiations, but get to conclusions. Let me just switch as well. I appreciate the work that you're doing, holding China accountable for what they're doing, dumping steel on the global stage. What concerns me, and I'm hoping that with your language about flexibility, that there is a recognition that there are countries out there who are going to be impacted by the tariffs. And, the EU can speak as a bloc. We've done things with Mexico and Canada. I do a lot of work with Brazil in the sense of my responsibilities here on the committee and studying their circumstances. I look at that as the kind of a country with a trade surplus with the United States, or the United States has a trade surplus with them. This question about the transshipment of steel, this is a country who I do not believe is engaged in that. We have a parallel trade in the sense that a lot of United States coal goes to Brazil in order to be used in some of the, the preparation of that steel, which comes in as a semi-finished product, which augments manufacturing here. So there's a lot of characteristics which are, I think, speaking to the idea that even though people have been identified, that these are the kinds of considerations that I would hope would qualify for, exclusions. I know that you said that there was going to be flexibility in that, and so I am asking if you believe that those are the kinds of criteria that would be relevant in the determinations about whether or not there's a basis for exemptions for countries like Brazil.
Mr. Ambassador, if you could hit that microphone.
Sorry, Chairman. On the first point, the cultural exemption really is very often just cultural protectionism, and there, you noted their de minimis standards are another example of just raw protectionism. And when we talk about wanting to limit people using standards and warning labels and the like, I always think that all these things can be, I mean, there's a legitimate case for some cultural exceptions, but it's not this kind of thing, and this is another example of protectionism, I fear. In the case of Brazil, there are a lot of things that would make Brazil an unusual circumstance. As we talked about before, you and I yesterday and prior, the fact that they're a huge semi-finished producer, and the fact that they have a lot of their production is basically a model, which is they send slab, or what we would call semi-finished steel, to related countries, companies in the United States, and then that's made into steel, which is sold in the U.S. So there are things that are unique about the Brazilian situation that at least we notionally have taken into consideration. That isn't to say that they would be successful in getting a remedy of getting an exclusion. I mean, that ultimately is going to be a question for the president. But there are factors there that are important.
Thank you, Ms. Noem. You're recognized. Thank you, Mr. Mia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here today. I represent the state of South Dakota, and this time of year, it's a lot of snow, it's really cold, and we watch a lot of basketball games. And my son plays basketball, so that's what we end up doing on a lot of winter evenings when I happen to be back in the state. But recently I was sitting at one of those basketball games, and I had something happen that has happened all too often recently. A local farmer came up and sat beside me and said, "Christy, do you know what the administration is thinking on trade right now? It seems like every time they take a position, soybeans drops 40 cents a bushel, and we can't hardly pay our bills today." And so it happens over and over again where a lot of farmers and ranchers are very concerned based on comments that come out of the administration or positions on what could happen to their commodity markets. It's because 73% of our commodities that are grown in South Dakota are exported to Mexico or Canada. And times are hard in farm country, a part of America that really strongly supported President Trump. They've endured a 45% drop in net farm income over the last 3 years. And its only indication is that it's going to get worse. So these farmers are very worried that the administration that they supported is going to lose them a trade deal over provisions that may be widely unpopular. A perfect example might be the sunset provision, which requires the deal to be renewed every 5 years. In my opinion, trade deals are meant to foster trust between nations and eliminate uncertainty in order to create more opportunities to sell our goods overseas. And the sunset provision undermines a trade deal's ability to develop necessary certainty to encourage businesses to invest. So I'm curious, Mr. Ambassador, if you would accept a final trade deal, a trade agreement without the provision in it.
Well, in the first place, I'm not going to sit here and negotiate with you in public, so that's not going to happen. I don't think that a sunset provision has any negative effect at all on farm sales.
You don't think it creates uncertainty every 5 years?
I don't think it has any effect at all. In fact, I think exactly the opposite. I think when you get close to that 5th year, what you're going to see is what you saw this year with Korea. That is to say, another $1 billion worth of sales. So what we did is the president created this so-called uncertainty in NAFTA, in chorus, and you saw $1 billion of additional sales of agricultural products in Korea. And because what they wanted to do was get the deficit down. And in my opinion, what you're going to see is as you approach that 50, you're going to see additional sales. So I think the people who say that, I think, are exactly wrong.
Do you have other examples besides that one instance? Because consistency in that would be incredibly important, that we have a background in historical examples of where, because all indications historically is when there is uncertainty in a trade provision is that you have commodity prices fluctuating and uncertainty for producers. And many producers market their grain a year in advance, or they may have to hang on to it waiting for better markets, and uncertainty causes them a lot of heartburn. Well, so is that the one instance that you could point to where it actually was advantageous, or is there more?
Well, to be honest, we've only renegotiated 2 agreements. We're in the process of course, and we're in the process of NAFTA, so it's a fairly small universe. But clearly there is a desire on behalf of people when you're going to look at the trade deficit to get the trade deficit down. Mm-hmm. That's number one. Number two, I don't see it as an enormous amount of uncertainty. The idea is to have you look back at an agreement after 5 years and determine whether or not the agreement is in the interest of the United States. If it is going to be as popular as everyone says it is going to be, and if it's going to be as great for farmers as everyone says it's going to be, why would we get rid of the agreement?
Mm-hmm. What, as far as adding clarity to how important the sunset provision is, you don't want to be more specific on if you would sign an agreement or agree to finalize an agreement that did not have it in it?
I think it's extremely important to me, and I'm not going to negotiate with you here in this forum for sure.
All right.
On this or any other provision.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Chu, you're recognized.
Ambassador Lighthizer, I know that you want to close NAFTA negotiations soon, but the IP chapter still has many outstanding issues. Stakeholders are worried that in trying to quickly close the chapters, the U.S. will not honor its commitments to reform and modernize the IP chapters, or that it may even negotiate away some of the key IP provisions for U.S. exporters that would in turn harm the U.S. economy. Now, I represent the Los Angeles area, the heart of the creative industries, and I'm co-chair of the Creative Rights Caucus. And so strong intellectual property protections are very, very important to me and really important to the U.S. When movies, television shows, and songs are consumed around the globe, the royalties are injected back into the U.S. economy. And in fact, the U.S. is widely recognized as the leader for the creative industries. The IP-intensive industries, these particular ones, account for $6.6 trillion in value added and more than 38% of the U.S. GDP, and it supports 45.5 million jobs. Well, unfortunately, Canada and Mexico don't place the same value on strong intellectual property, particularly copyright protections, as the U.S. does. Since the NAFTA IP discussions have remained at an impasse for months now, what assurance can you give me that USTR is working to ensure Mexico and Canada protect U.S. intellectual property in their markets?
So first of all, I would say with respect to what progress has gone on till now, there's been an enormous amount of time spent on it. People have talked back and forth, so we understand each other. This is one of those issues that is never resolved until the very end of a negotiation, as I'm sure you know. The reality is exactly as you say. Canada and Mexico are both takers of intellectual property. They're not protectors of intellectual property. Most people are not surprised about that with respect to Mexico, but it is surprising with respect to Canada. Canada has third world intellectual property protection, and getting them to accept first world is not easy. However, the speed with which we close NAFTA, and many people would say if we close it in the next few months, it would still not have been fast. But that won't have any effect on where we come out on this. This is a very important issue. We understand it's an important issue. I believe there are forces in Canada who understand that they have to, at some point, become a fully developed country on this issue because they certainly have a lot of intellectual property potential. So I'm inclined, there are people there who really think they should be on our side of this issue. But I can't give assurances. It certainly is our position that we want to have strong protection of intellectual property. We think it's not only important for the United States, but important for all the rest of these countries to do it. It's in their interest to do it.
Well, you're saying that this is one of those chapters that might be saved for the last, but can you assure me that the intellectual property provisions, historically, some of the most technically and politically sensitive free trade agreement provisions will not be negotiated away or conceded in the final hours of NAFTA renegotiations?
Well, it certainly is not my intention to do that, but I can't very well negotiate with you. I wouldn't negotiate with her. I can't negotiate with you either. It just wouldn't be fair. But this is a very important issue for us. We are completely in your camp, and we hope that you call and say what a great job we did when the time's over. I know you'll call.
Okay. Well, on another subject, one of the keys to ensuring our trade agreements is strong enforcement, particularly of our labor obligations. Now, we have agreements with Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Peru, and Honduras, and there have been labor violations that have been filed in each one of these countries. In fact, there are numerous violations that include violence against unionists, inadequate labor inspections and enforcement actions, and so forth. And yet, in most of these cases, there hasn't even been an update from the administration. What are you going to do to enforce these labor agreements?
Well, we have provisions in each of the trade agreements with these people that have labor provisions, and we are in the process of following the process that we have to file for dispute settlement in those cases. It's clearly something that we brought to their attention. It's very troubling. It's a very troubling trend, and unfortunately, it's not just these countries. It's in a lot of other countries in that part of the world. So it's something that we agree with you on, and we're in the process of prosecuting these cases following the process that is set out in the agreement.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for taking your time out and being here today. The folks in Southeast and South Central Missouri are very optimistic about the future. If you look at the past year under President Trump's leadership, we passed a $5.5 trillion tax cut for American farmers and small businesses. We've repealed hundreds of burdensome regulations and created over 1.6 million new jobs. Speaking of new jobs, as of just the day after the president did his tariffs on aluminum and steel, I was in Southeast Missouri announcing 450 new jobs with the new aluminum smelter opening up. So these are real changes and real aspects that's affecting real people that have not always been on the right side of victories. The next step for us is to go out and negotiate the best possible trade deals so that American farmers, businesses, and workers win around the world. We couldn't have a better person leading the way. The president wrote a book on creating great agreements. In the book, he quoted, "The worst thing you can possibly do in a deal is to seem desperate, to make it. The best thing you can do is to deal from strength. And leverage is the best strength you can have," on page 53, in fact. The president knows where our strengths are. They are in our hardworking people, our superior goods, and our world-leading services. Mr. Lighthizer, you know this as well, and the task before you in NAFTA and potentially KORUS and other deals is not an easy one. While those are the hot topics, I want to talk to you about some unfair trading practices. I do want to applaud you and the president for its trade enforcement actions in the World Trade Organization. Like I mentioned before, America is ready to compete as long as the playing field is level. But unfair trading practices disadvantage American farmers. To ignore violations of trade agreements does not strengthen free trade. In fact, it weakens free trade. This has been a mounting evidence that certain countries are ignoring WTO obligations by providing price supports to farmers well above the commitments they agreed to. The results in surplus production that ends up in the world markets, displacing sales of U.S. farmers. It is not conservative to allow for rampant breaches of contracts. It's just wrong. In what ways is this administration leaning into the WTO to ensure that these countries play by the rules?
First of all, I agree with everything you said.
Well, then I must be right. That's great.
Yeah, there are some people who disagree with me from time to time in this committee, but I know. So I completely agree. You're absolutely right. We are seeing a proliferation of agriculture subsidies. We just have. In the last ministerial round we had in Buenos Aires, I ended up hanging up the round or the negotiations because people wanted to their idea of an ag negotiation was a negotiation wherein countries could have more subsidies rather than fewer subsidies. They call it this sort of food programs, but the reality is what it was going to do was going to do nothing but encourage more subsidies in agriculture. So we have gone all this far to try to get ourselves into a market environment, and we said, no, we're not going to be in a position to change that. And it was India who was very much a new subsidizer, and
with their rice and their grains.
You're exactly right. And they were very much in favor of having negotiations, really, in my judgment at least, about increasing subsidies. So we said, no, we're not going to do that. Every time we find a situation, we bring a WTO case. The WTO, however, is not the greatest forum for enforcement of these kinds of actions. And it's always a problem if somebody does subsidies or dumps in our market, we have tools to deal with that. If they're hurting us because they're doing something as a result of subsidies in their market or in a third market, the tools are not that good. So you have to go to the WTO, and it's a cumbersome, far from flawless forum. So we are aggressively bringing these cases. We completely agree with you. We're using the tools we have at hand, and hopefully we can improve those tools and make a difference.
Please continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rice, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for being here today. I've told you publicly and privately that your presence in the administration and Mr. Ross's are two of the main reasons I have so much faith in this administration. I appreciate a man of your experience taking on this job, and it's so important for the American worker. I'm a big believer in American competitiveness. I think our tax code went a long way toward helping our economy be competitive in the world, and trade is very important in American competitiveness, obviously. Also infrastructure, a lot of the things that the president, or immigration, a lot of the things the president's trying to work on. If we could get 2 or 3 more of those notched, our economy would be well poised in the world. With respect to the tariffs, my opinion is, as you said, nobody wins in a trade war, but nobody disagrees that there aren't people who have been bad actors in the world, China particularly, and we've ignored it for too long to the destruction of the American middle class. And so we just can't accept that anymore. We've got to respond, and it needs to be targeted, and I appreciate your efforts in that regard. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about NAFTA. You know, I've been to Montreal, met you in Montreal, been to Mexico City, met with Mexican officials and regulatory people and business people and chambers of commerce, and in Canada the same, and in America the same. And I haven't met anybody who doesn't think that NAFTA doesn't need to be continued and that it doesn't need to be modernized. Everybody's pretty much on board. And the same topics are brought up, the same 4 or 5 things you've raised today, with rules of origin and de minimis rules and all these things. So it sounds like you're making great progress there, and I just am comforted, having been in both of those places, that everybody recognizes that this modernization process is a good thing and needs to be pursued. But I wanted to zero in on one question that was asked to you at the American Chamber of Commerce in Canada, and I loved your response to it. And And I just wanted to ask you so you could respond publicly to everybody. What would you see as a win in NAFTA? What is your goal? What are you shooting for when you're trying to renegotiate this? Can you explain that to the public?
Can you give me a hint what I might have said? If it was such a good answer, I don't want to change it at this point. Look, from our point of view, first of all, we have to have an agreement that's good for all three countries, right? I mean, we have to have that. Secondly, we want an agreement that's going to end up getting these trade deficits down. We have large trade deficits, and it has to move more jobs to the United States and create better jobs, not only more jobs, but higher paying jobs. I'm in the group that thinks what we really need is a little bit of wage inflation. So I want to do something. In the first place, I think it has to be in everyone's interest or you won't get an agreement. But I want it to be something that gets the trade deficit down. I want it to be something that creates jobs, that move some of these jobs back to the United States. They're all not coming back. We understand that completely. But this notion that none of them are coming back has been proven wrong by all of you because you've seen what happened after your tax bill. It has moved jobs back. It just has. So jobs, wages are what the president is focused on. That's what I'm focused on. And I think that this agreement will lead to efficiency and it will lead to higher wages and more jobs in the United States.
That's pretty much the same answer you gave in Canada, except you said one other thing. I want to eliminate incentives to offshore. All those are great objectives. I want to point out one anecdotal thing. When we were in Canada having lunch with the Canadian American Business Council, and a tax consultant from Canada said, where we have clients that have positions in America and in Canada, we're advising them to ramp down in Canada and ramp up in America because of the tax reform bill. It seems we've lost our competitive advantage. And under my breath, I said, yes. So I appreciate very much your efforts to lift the American middle class. It's smaller and hadn't had a raise since 1990, and I think tax reform and your efforts will change that. Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And I would like to say I'm going to get credit, some of the credit for this tax bill. I mean, they're going to say, look, the trade deficit went down. I'm not going to give you any credit when that happens. It's going to be entirely the trade policy.
We know how that works, Mr. Ambassador. So, Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, thank you. Appreciate your patience here for the last 3 hours dealing with our questions and comments. I must say that I appreciate the role that USTR has assumed on an area that I've been working on for the last 10 years, dealing with illegal logging, particularly what's going on in Peru. It's been sort of a struggle. I thought it was harder than it should have been in the last administration, but I appreciate the work that you and your team have done. This, as you know, is not just an issue of enforcing trade obligations. Illegal logging damages the environment. It undercuts the rule of law in developing countries, and it has negative impacts on Americans who play by the rules. And I just wanted to say how much I appreciated that. And I do want to identify myself with comments that my friends Mr. Thompson and Mr. Doggett mentioned earlier. I won't take my time or yours, but I am concerned about having American wine industry, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, on a level playing field. And I am concerned about American interference with the ability of other countries to protect the health of their citizens. And I appreciate there are nuances there, but historically, I think we could have done more to be more open. I think it is a larger issue, and I hope that we can collectively focus on this because I think it is very significant. I listened to my friend from Missouri referenced The Art of the Deal or some such publication by the president. I think there's a pretty significant difference when you're negotiating in real estate, when you can, as he states in his book, exaggerate, as you can go bankrupt and leave other people holding the bag when things collapse and move on to the next project. We're talking about the American economy. We're talking about our role in the world. And I think, for example, exaggerating or making things up in a discussion with the head of the state of an ally and admitting it publicly doesn't help us on the world stage. And I identify with some of my colleagues who say we feel more comfortable knowing you are in the role that you're in. You have broad experience, and I think understand some of these dynamics. And it's in that context I would like to just raise one point with you, and that deals with some of the impacts of the imposition of tariffs under the 301 with China, particularly as it affects retail trade. And Mr. Reichert and I have some involvement with companies that are involved with apparel and footwear. And we've been working for a long time to try and see if we can have some more rational policy as it relates to tariffs. As you well know, tariffs are not just magically imposed on somebody else. It's a cost of doing business. It affects what happens with American manufacturers and retail. And they are ultimately paid by the consumer. And we have a system now that is tilted against low and moderate income people. When you look at clothing and footwear, the percentage that is paid at the lower end is really quite outrageous. And I am hopeful that we don't rush into something with China that ends up actually making it worse. So I'm hopeful that this is an area that can be entered with great sensitivity. Mr. Chairman, I would request unanimous consent to enter into the record correspondence addressed to the White House, but also to the ambassador and the committee that speaks to this in terms of tariff understanding the dynamic. And I wondered if you had any observations that you could offer.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. If you could offer any observations that might make some of my constituents feel better.
I would say, first of all, when you talked about the quote from The Art of the Deal, all I was thinking was, I hope I don't look desperate. So I had a different take on it than you did. We understand, and I kind of went through this, if there are tariffs, one, you have to establish through an algorithm what the amount is and use as much science as you can. And two, when you pick the products on which you would put a tariff, you start with a logarithm that tries to maximize the effect on China and minimize the effect on U.S. consumers. And if you think about products on a graph, you'll have kind of a line over here of products where they are minimally a problem for U.S. consumers and maximally a problem for Canada. Now, you can't always follow that, but that's one of the big factors, and that's part of the logarithm. And we are we are aware of that and are cognizant of it. And if we end up doing this, it won't be perfect, but you will see a methodology of which you will say, yes, that's a sensible method. That's what I believe.
Time has expired. Mr. Schweikert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, first, just a quick comment on sort of a global basis, and particularly more for even some of your newer staff. Long term, some of us have a fascination of what worldwide trade can do, particularly considering our demographic issues. You know, as a country where we're, as we're getting much older, we're going to need populations of folks in the prime consumer ages for us to sell stuff to. So that's always, in a long term, there's some great articles about, trade actually may help us with some of our demographic that we're facing, and it's just math. Mr. Ambassador, I first want to thank you on the de minimis. The last time you and I had an opportunity to talk about it, you not only got it, you were an amazing advocate, particularly if some of our other countries we're presently negotiating with are listening to this hearing right now. There's many of us on this committee that are absolutely just fixated on the de minimis value with Mexico and Canada and the inequities that creates. Do you think they're hearing that part of the discussion?
I certainly hope so. It's one of those issues where anybody who starts focusing on it, it becomes more and more important to them, because it affects a lot of product. And the more you study it, the more it's bothersome, of products coming into other countries in bulk, being broken up into smaller things and being shipped. The fact that most of the Canadian, one of the articles I read, most of the Canadian online sellers sell far more in the U.S. than they do in Canada. And we can't go in that direction essentially at all. I mean, $20 versus $800 is just ridiculous. So it's a hugely important issue. It affects an enormous number of sectors. So it is something that is very important to us. And I look at what everybody knows the right answer is to be above $20. There's no one that can argue that.
Well,
you can argue 800, but you can't argue. It has to go up.
And you make look, for those of us, and being a border state, Arizona, where we're trying to set up trade hubs and inland ports, and yet if you look at the current de minimis, particularly with our trading partner in Mexico, it's all going to be inbound. Because our ability for small retailers, for high-tech commerce to go outbound, it just doesn't work. Just because time is so precious. I am one of those states, communities, because being in the desert Southwest, has intense concern on seasonal tariffs. Just because if you actually sort of game theory it, it creates distortions and then retributions on the distortions. And if you actually start thinking about when certain crops come in and the seasonalities, it ends up becoming very, very ugly. And particularly for those of us who do a lot of cash crop growing, because Arizona provides the winter lettuce crop for the country. And if you're doing seasonal tariffs, the tails of those tariffs end up creating some real pricing distortions, particularly for our consumers on both sides of the border.
So you're against the proposal?
Absolutely livid.
There are an enormous number of products that would be subject to these that come in from Mexico through Arizona. I just want, and so it's basically, it's the interest of importers in that state. And I just wanted to make sure that I was understood. Well, I've heard the argument.
It actually gets a little more complicated. If you're doing certain types of cash crops and you've just had a seasonal tariff that benefited the growing season in one part of the country, then it falls off. All of a sudden, you're on the pricing fall side. And so it's just that if you think of that constant moving of that sort of bell curve. Last thing, and look, you've spoken about this elegantly, though I substantially disagree with some of the characterization, ISDS. And I know so often rhetorically we have speakers that will say, well, it's sovereignty. But if you actually really walk through the mechanisms, it absolutely is not. It is to that issue. It doesn't rewrite our laws, or the Mexican laws, or the Canadian laws. It's not a precedence for the next case. Ultimately, it's think of it more like a if we were to ever lose, which we have not, you would have to pay compensation. But it does not rewrite your sovereign statutes. And so when people use the sovereignty quotes, I think it's an absolute distortion of how it actually works. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Time has expired. Ms. Walorski, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, it's good to see you. It will come no surprise to you, I want to talk about 232. Just a couple of point of clarifications. So it's my understanding, and I would just want you to confirm this, that you are considering participating in the Global Forum on Excess Steel Capacity. That is under consideration?
I mean, we do participate, and one of the things we've asked people who might get an exclusion is that they participate and help us with that, and most of these countries do, by the way.
The recent Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity held a first minister-level meeting last November, but you were not there, correct?
No, that's correct. I had no deputies in place at that time, so I was staying here.
I understand. Will you in the future attend those yourself, since the rest of the world is looking at this with incredible significance and bringing their ministerial level folks to the table?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't guarantee an all. I would say I think at that meeting, I think there were maybe 3 ministers. So it might have been a ministerial level, but I think about 30 countries did not send ministers, and about 3 did. And the 3
But the one that I'm concerned about is you in this country.
Well, I understand, but I just want to suggest that the idea was that it was like this ministerial level. So you had Europe sent one, because it was basically around the corner. You had the German minister who doesn't have competence in the area, but it was good to be there. And I think there may There may have been one or two other.
Yeah, but the reason I'm asking the question, Ambassador, is because while all of those countries have irons in the fire here, you are the ambassador that's going to go forth under all these rules in 232, and I want you to do as best as you can for our nation and for my district, and that's my concern. And I believe that you can, and I believe that you will. I want to switch gears, though, really quickly to this issue of retaliation. In my district in northern Indiana, with the second largest concentration of manufacturing jobs in the country, there's a whole host of ag that I'm concerned about. Corn, soybeans, dairy, pork, poultry, beef, eggs, tomatoes, and the list goes on. But half of the soybeans grown in Indiana are exported to China. Honeywell makes brakes and avionics in South Bend that go into Boeing airplanes. China is threatening retaliation against both. In fact, today, China's state-run Global Times ran an article alleging that the U.S. is dumping soybeans into China and calling for strong restrictive measures. Corn and motorboats are exported from my district to the EU. Both of those are on the EU's retaliation list. Setting aside the tariffs, there's an incredible amount of anxiety in my district over the threat of retaliation. That anxiety is shared regardless of industry because manufacturers, suppliers, farmers, and workers will be affected. Are you considering the devastating effect that retaliatory measures could have, especially on small business and family farms that absolutely do not have the resources to absorb big losses?
Yes.
In what way?
We are gaming out what would happen, what the most likely areas are that you would retaliation, what kinds of things that you would do. We can't be in a position where we take no action because of threats of retaliation. That's how you end up having an $800 billion trade deficit, which costs literally millions and millions of jobs in America. But there is a legitimate threat, and as I've said a few times here today and many times in the past, agriculture is always on the front line of retaliation. I said that when I first testified. Members would say to me, do you think we should be concerned? I said, if you're in agriculture, you always have to be concerned. Anything that happens is going to have, they're going to figure we can get it and do something on agriculture. So it's an unfair situation, but it's one that we have to come to grips with. And you have to think about counter-retaliation. You have to think about programs for farmers who are in this situation. I mean, there's a lot of things that are outside of my realm that have to be considered, but it's a serious problem, and we're very aware of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Ambassador Lighthizer for joining us today to talk about the Trump administration's trade agenda. For many years now, when Democrats have been talking about the impacts that trade agreements have on American workers, and we lament the fact that they've caused countless good-paying American jobs to be shipped overseas, most notably in the manufacturing sector. And those jobs are really the bedrock of the American middle class and critical for our economy. Those jobs have been lost to countries whose labor standards are impossible for our workers to compete with on a level playing field. So I think that a lot of us were really hopeful when the president talked about bringing American manufacturing jobs back and creating new jobs through renegotiating our existing trade deals. This administration, time and time again, has said that they want a level playing field for American workers, but I have yet to hear the administration lay out a clear vision for how you plan to achieve this goal. It's no secret that we met with Secretary Ross last year, and when I pressed him on that issue, what is your strategy for bringing back American jobs or maintaining American jobs here, the only answer that he provided us was that they're going to renegotiate the rules of origin for autos. That was it. That was his single sole idea or a plan for bringing back manufacturing jobs. And I think we have to do a lot more than that if we're going to create the kind of jobs that we want here and ensure that American workers and industries are not on an unlevel playing field, first of all, and second of all, in a race to the bottom for wages and working conditions. Workers in Mexico earn a pittance of what U.S. workers make, and is it any wonder that we're losing jobs to Mexico? And I think Canada as well has a vested interest because their labor standards are similar to ours. So, Mr. Ambassador, I would like to know, the president has said that he will bring back jobs through renegotiating trade deals. What pieces of NAFTA specifically are you negotiating that you think is going to deliver on that promise?
Well, I would say, first of all, the most important thing that has been done so far is to pass the tax bill. So that was a very important part in terms of bringing.
I'm not talking about the tax bill. I'm talking about renegotiation of NAFTA.
I understand that.
I want to know specifically what parts of NAFTA would you renegotiate to ensure that U.S. jobs stay in this country or that we bring back jobs that we've lost?
And I think the regulatory improvements you've made have helped also. So what are the things?
I'm not talking about regulatory. Can we stick to the subject matter of this hearing, please? What pieces of NAFTA will you renegotiate to ensure that we keep U.S. jobs here and bring back manufacturing jobs that we've lost?
Well, I would say the first thing is the rules of origin. The rules of origin, not just for...
Okay, aside from auto rules of origin, what is the plan?
We have a plan for, we have a plan for labor standards. We have a plan
What is the plan for labor standards? Lay that out for me, specifics.
Well, in the first place, there's a limit to how much I'm going to talk about this in a public forum. I'm sure you can understand that. So I'm involved in a negotiation with two countries.
I understand that.
All right, good. So I've already talked about this a couple times, but I'll do it again. It's our view that U.S. workers have the right to expect that collective bargaining agreements in Mexico are the result of secret ballots and legitimately verified to be such. There's a whole series of processes that we're involved with in negotiating that element, including even today. So that's a hugely important issue. And the objective is to try to get wages up in Mexico, which makes the United States more competitive, but also creates customers for the United States.
So would it be fair to say would it be fair to say that you're seeking labor standards with our trading partners that are on the level with U.S. labor standards, or do you intend to bring U.S. labor standards down to the lowest common denominator?
Did I say anything at all about U.S. labor standards? If I did, I misspoke. We're doing nothing about U.S. labor standards.
Oh, I'm just asking a simple
question.
Well,
and the answer is we're dealing with the Mexican labor standards. We're not dealing with the United States labor standards.
Okay, so it's fair to say then you are trying to raise the standards of our trading partners to comparable to that of the United States? Is that what I'm hearing?
No. What I'm trying to do is raise the standards in Mexico.
So you raise it, but not to U.S. standards, not that high, somewhere in between.
It is not my point. What I'm focusing on is the basic elements of what you expect in basic labor law. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about U.S. standards.
ILO conventions of labor law, or
there are
standards?
All time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, if I could simply just make the request that we receive the answer to the last question in writing.
In writing, absolutely.
Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. I will tell you, I see significant wins for U.S. in energy, agriculture, telecommunications, digital trade, services, technology, manufacturing, because you're being so aggressive in these areas. We appreciate the work there. Mr. Curbelo, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Ambassador. Thank you so much for your time. I first want to say I was thrilled to hear earlier your statements regarding engagement with Argentina and Brazil. I think that our country, in many ways, has been absent in our own neighborhood over the last few decades. And I think in both those countries, we're seeing very positive developments. And this is very exciting for South Florida, as you can imagine, because we are poised to grow and to benefit greatly from further engagement in the region, specifically with countries like Brazil and Argentina. On a couple issues that have been discussed extensively here, I want to associate myself with the comments made by Chairman Brady and others on ISDS. I think it's an important tool for American companies, for American stakeholders, and also with Chairman Johnson on the Sunset Clause. I do believe that one of the major components to successful business and to enterprise generally is certainty. And I think that if companies are operating under the threat of the expiration of a deal, that could inhibit their ability to invest. And by the way, it's not just American companies' investments abroad, but the investments of Canadian and Mexican companies in the United States. So I really hope that we have a strong provision to review the deal, to revisit the deal, to make sure we keep it up to date, which we haven't done over the last 25 years, but certainly not always to have the threat of a potential expiration. Another issue I wanted to bring up is the effect trade agreements have on the farmers of my South Florida district. Many people not from South Florida might be surprised to know that Miami-Dade County is one of the largest ag-producing counties in the state. We have avocados, mangoes, tomatoes, and hundreds of specialty crops, and because South Florida is significantly warmer than even central parts of the state, crops can be grown year-round. For example, Ambassador, it is not snowing in South Florida today, something we're very pleased with. So as we renegotiate NAFTA, I'm concerned with how the deal will affect the farmers across Florida, but specifically with how it will impact the agriculture community I'm honored to represent in South Dade. I know the administration has been advancing a seasonal and perishable proposal that could help provide relief to our growers from Mexican dumping by making it easier to prove injury. Can you give us a brief update on where we are and what the nature of the administration's commitment with this provision is at this time?
Well, it is a provision that's very important and not without its controversy. The point that I've tried to make is that while we have a lot of agricultural sales in Mexico, with Mexico, we have a agricultural sales deficit of about $5 billion. So we're not on the positive side of our agricultural sales with Mexico. The area that is most affected negatively are the seasonal and perishable fruits and vegetables, as you suggest. So we have a provision that we have designed that allows those people only in cases where there is unfair trade to take advantage of the unfair trade statutes. Till now, they are essentially precluded by the nature of the way the statutes are taken up. So we have put forward this proposal. It has not been wildly popular with our trading partners, I would say in all candor at this point, but it's an important provision and one that we're negotiating on right now.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I encourage you to do the best you can in this area. We know that the specific proposal you've put forward may not be able to make it, but I think anything that improves the status quo for these farmers, which have been decimated, quite frankly, would be something that we would welcome. And I'm more concerned with fairness and less concerned with this deficit issue. I always tell people I have a deficit, my family has a trade deficit with the supermarket, and we want to keep it that way. We're not interested in changing that. I think the key question is it fair? And are American companies, in this case American farmers, being given the same opportunities to compete as Mexican farmers, as Canadian farmers? And I think in this area of seasonal products, it's certainly not the case. So I appreciate your commitment to this provision and your commitment to the farmers of South Florida, which are counting on us to improve the status quo. Thank you, Ambassador. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here today and for your time and effort. I know this is a long hearing, and you've waited all this time. I appreciate it. NAFTA is vitally important to the state of Michigan, the state that I represent. It's important to our economy, and it's important to the U.S. automakers. I want to applaud your efforts for the way you've conducted yourself. I had the opportunity to attend the last round in Montreal. It's evident to me and to all of us that you have done a spectacular, world-class job in representing the United States and in preserving, to the extent that you can, the great relationship that we have with Canada and Mexico. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank you for your efforts to update and improve NAFTA so that it better represents the 21st century global economy. I'd like to continue, if I could, the subject that's been raised ad nauseum here, but important. It has to do with the rules of origin, and the concern I have specifically on behalf of the U.S. automakers is that there is substantial concern that the proposed rules of origin will jeopardize their global competitive position and that furthermore will likely cost vital U.S. manufacturing jobs. And that's especially true in the state of Michigan. Now, I know this is high in your mind. You've indicated in your original testimony, you said that the purpose of the rules of origin proposal was to move more jobs back to the United States. But are you concerned that the aggregate impact of the proposed rules of origin might have the exact opposite effect than what you intended? And also, we're also aware that the Canadian government introduced in the last round in Mexico City a modified version of their proposed rules of origin. I wonder if you might elucidate on that proposal, and also whether or not Mexico has its own proposal regarding the rules of origin. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your kind remarks. The rules of origin are extremely important, as you say. Our objective is to bring more jobs back to Michigan, and we think that the direction that we're moving will have that effect. The United States had a proposal. Canada had a proposal. I think, and Mexico has been engaged on the issue. And I think we are in a position where we're finally starting to converge. We're working very closely with the U.S. industry. I had people on Monday, and I think maybe even still till to yesterday in Detroit, trying to work out the details of this kind of an agreement. Once again, I can't really say exactly what's going to end up happening, but I think we're in a pretty good place. But our objective is to stop the hemorrhage of jobs from the United States and to bring jobs back to the United States. That's our objective. The way we analyze this thing is that Canada and Mexico basically sell their cars to the United States. So in the case of the United States, we sell 900,000 cars. To Canada, they sell almost 2 million to us. In the case of Mexico, they sell us, I don't know what the numbers are, maybe 2.3 million. We send them 200,000. So basically, these are industries that are designed to sell cars in the United States. It's not unreasonable for us to say, if you're going to do that, we ought to have rules of origin that get some fair share of that manufacturing in the U.S. So how much are you actually working with? In the case of trucks, it's 25%. We have an enormous amount of leverage. In the case of cars, it's 2.5%, so that's $900 a car. That's what we're talking about. Our view is if you're going to save $900, it's not unreasonable to say some part of that should come back in employment in the United States. At some point, you're right, you make it to the point where they can't compete, and that's clearly, we're aware of that. That's not our objective. Our objective is to sort of find that sweet spot where we get some of these jobs back. We are the market. We can't forget that. We're the market for all these cars. It's not like they're going north and south, except in small numbers.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your sharing that information with us. I agree with you 100%. The goal is to try and get as many jobs back to the United States. We like to hear that in Michigan. It's the #1 part of our economy is our manufacturing sector, especially in autos. So we appreciate your efforts and we appreciate your attention to this. And I'm glad to hear that your team has been in Detroit to talk to our folks. Thank you, sir. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. LaHood, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for your service to our country. Ambassador, my district is the 8th largest ag district in the country in terms of corn and soybean production. We have some of the most fertile farmland in the entire world, and there is real concern with farmers and agriculture folks on the administration's position on NAFTA and withdrawal. And you know, a couple statistics that I think are important. 98% of the corn that Mexico imports comes from the United States, much of it from the Midwest. About 1/3 of the products produced in Illinois go to Canada or Mexico. About 35,000 jobs tied directly to NAFTA. And that's just in agriculture. And by the way, agriculture is the #1 industry in the state of Illinois. And when I've heard repeatedly about withdrawal, you know, the groups that I work with, National Pork Producers Council, American Farm Bureau Federation, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, National Corn Growers Association, Corn Refineries Association, American Soybean Association, Americans for Farmers and Families, all, you know, agree that withdrawal is not an option here. would you, I guess my question to you, Ambassador, is do you know any ag groups that think withdrawal is the right approach?
Our objective is not to withdraw. Our objective is to get a good and improved agreement. So I don't know of any ag groups that want to withdraw. I don't, but I don't know whether there may be some out there. I'm not aware of them, no. But our objective is not to withdraw either. Our objective is to get the best agreement we can. It's an important agreement. It's whatever it is. We always say, Mr. Chairman, it's $1 trillion worth of trade. The reality is last year it was like $1.1 or $1.2 trillion worth of trade. It's an enormous amount of trade between the three countries, and our objective is to figure out a way to have this agreement be more beneficial to the United States, and that certainly means more beneficial to American agriculture.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments on that. I, for the record, will submit an article from Farm Week in February that's titled NAFTA is U.S. Farmers' Lifeline. And in there they talk about if the U.S. quits on NAFTA, it quits on its farmers. And the other thing is, I know the president recently tweeted, NAFTA is a bad joke. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I don't even, I have no idea about that quote. So I have
well, it was a tweet.
No knowledge. I didn't see that.
Well, I would just tell you that causes a lot of concern, Mr. Ambassador, when farmers, and by the way, the farmers in my district and in rural America overwhelmingly support the president and continue to support him, particularly on all the things we've talked about today. But I can't emphasize enough the concern with farmers in rural America when it comes to NAFTA. Let me switch subjects here. Rules of origin has been talked about a lot here. When we think about the constituencies that we all deal with, Mr. Ambassador, can you name a constituency that agrees with your position on rules of origin? For instance, Chamber of Commerce, National Federation of Business, Heritage Foundation.
How about the AFL-CIO? Do they count?
So okay, that's fair. So AFL-CIO, any business groups that you can cite?
I don't know. There are business groups all over the place. I have no idea where they are on rules of origin.
Could you submit those for the record, whatever those are?
No, I can't. I don't know. I don't have the resources to go out. If the chairman wants me to go out and have my people look resources, find out where business groups are on the rules of origin, I'll do it. But otherwise, I won't.
Well, I guess the concern is, as we look at the trade agreements we have in place in FTAs, when we look at these provisions, ISDS, we've talked about rules of origin, sunset provision, these all appear to be very unorthodox and unconventional as we negotiate NAFTA, as we look at our other trade agreements. And so I think there's real concern, Mr. Ambassador, with the position that we've had there and having a trade policy. And with that, I want to just mention, last year when you were gone through your Senate confirmation, the administration quoted, "You will be shocked by the speed at which bilateral trade agreements will begin to materialize." And so I'm a supporter of bilateral trade agreements. Many of us are, but we're 15 months into this administration, and we have not seen a template or a model for bilateral trade agreements. And I understand you haven't had people in place, and I'm cognizant of that. But, when we look at, well, is there a model, is there a mechanism out there, particularly with your position on ISDS, rules of origin, and sunset? Can you comment on that?
Well, I'll comment on all of it. I'm not going to do it in 9 seconds, however. Number one, of course we're going to have different policies in the Chamber of Commerce. Their policies is what have gotten us $800 billion worth of trade deficits. So, of course, we're going to have unconventional policies. If we're going to have a different result, if we do exactly the same thing, nothing's going to change. This is an unsustainable trade deficit. We have a $560 billion goods and services trade deficit. We have a deficit with China which can't go on. It's $375 billion. We're going to do things differently, absolutely. I personally believe that these people who voted for the president voted for him because they didn't want it to be exactly like half of those groups want it to be. So of course it's going to be different, number one. Number two, in terms of, am I out of time? All right.
Way out of time.
I'm not going to number two.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
Mr. Reed, you're recognized.
Mr. Ambassador, way over here. So it's a pleasure to have you here today. And I want to just follow up. The unconventional nature of what this administration is doing is something I applaud and I have stood with because I agree that we just cannot maintain the status quo because, as to your point, this policy is unsustainable. But I think we all want to get to the same outcome. And that's where I think we have broad agreement in regards to the issues before us today. And Mr. Ambassador, I would be remiss not to go on the record to raise the issues of dairy and wine coming from Western New York. The Finger Lakes wine industry is blossoming, and the access to, and our dairy farmers of Western New York, the access to Canada, obviously, and I've shared this with you, and I shared this with Prime Minister Trudeau directly, is very critical to our future. So I just put that on the record. But what I want to do is ask some questions that maybe haven't been covered here. And one of the issues that I have been very concerned about in my entire tenure as a member of Congress on the issue of trade is currency manipulation and state-owned enterprises. And I so appreciate my understanding of the negotiations that you're having right now with Canada and Mexico, that those issues are being discussed, those issues are being potentially put on the table in regards to updating NAFTA. And one, do you agree that there are issues of currency manipulation across the world with other trading partners such as China, Japan, European Union members? And if that is the case, how do you see the present negotiations being a tool to put us in a position where we can take on truly what I believe is one of the unfair practices that is out there that's gone unaddressed for decades?
First of all, Congressman, I completely agree with you. I think it's one of the absolutely fundamental problems is this issue of currency manipulation. And it's China, which everyone agrees to. If you go to the auto companies, they're going to tell you it's Japan, and it varies, but it's 6, 7, 8, 9%. If you multiply, I mean, we're worried about 2.5% on our auto tariffs. I mean, if a currency manipulation is 6%, then it's multiples of that. It's also an issue, we believe, with Korea. So the administration is dealing with this on a variety of areas. And I tell you, I sit down with the pros who do this, who work for me, my professional people who do this, have done this for 30 years. And I'll say, well, what did you do the last time you had this or that kind of conversation with the Treasury Department on the issue of currency manipulation? And you know what they say? We've never had a serious conversation with any Treasury Department before this Treasury Department. Secretary Mnuchin is completely engaged on this in a way that no former, I mean, literally my career people, Republicans and Democrats, are like, we've never had a conversation like this where people really have to come to grips with the issue of currency manipulation. So we're dealing with it in the context of NAFTA, even though we realize these countries are not really currency manipulators, but they have the same interest we do in tackling this problem. And where you go, we'll see. Clearly, a huge, huge impact is, or factor is transparency. We started off with the position we don't even know what these people are doing. And competitive currency devaluation is clearly something that's unacceptable. So it's a complicated issue. It's something that we're involved with, but it's a Treasury issue more than it is ours. And we have Treasury officials, besides the Secretary, David Malpass, the Undersecretary, are completely locked in on this issue. And they're going to get absolutely as much as you can get on it. But I don't think you can overstate how important it is, and I think it'll be more important in 10 years than it is now if we don't do something about it.
Well, I totally agree with you, Mr. Ambassador, and I look forward to working with you as well as the Treasury Secretary, as I've had raised this issue with prior Treasury Secretaries in our tenure here. The other issue that I wanted to just highlight and stress to you is, as we deal with intellectual property, and I know it's been touched on a little bit here across the panel, but coming from an area with some interests that have really been a bright spot in regards to our innovation economy and the development of technology, I just wondered what your commitment or thoughts are on how we can best protect our intellectual property, our innovation, and the next generation of the economy opportunities I see coming down the pipeline for us.
First of all, you understate the importance of intellectual property in your district. It's extremely important, and we understand that. And because it's important, those companies, particularly one company, is important for the whole economy. So we are completely committed, both in NAFTA, where I've talked about what our provisions are. Till now, there has really been a movement away from protection of intellectual property. In the last administration, there was a movement away from the protection of intellectual property. We are recentering that, in our opinion. But even more importantly, I would suggest the whole 301, the whole IP protection with China, that is the absolute front line of protection of intellectual property.
Appreciate the hard work, Mr. Ambassador. Look forward to working with you. But yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Holding, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you for being here. You've missed an incredible winter wonderland that's going on the outside today. Be glad you'll be going down the hill after this rather than having to come up the hill. Regarding the tariffs on aluminum and steel, I'd just encourage you to move expeditiously to determine which of our trading partners will be exempt from these new tariffs. There are countries that we obviously know are routinely engaged in unfair trading practices, but there are other countries which are undeniable allies to the United States, not only economically, but for our national security as well. And you and I have talked before about the special relationship the United States has with the United Kingdom, and we've discussed the tremendous opportunity that's presented to the United States as the United Kingdom exits the European Union. The United Kingdom and the U.S. have a long-standing relationship. It goes without saying, and it's certainly one of our closest allies. So as you go through the exclusion process for specific countries, I'd hope that the United Kingdom is quickly identified by your office as being exempt. And I'm sure you're also aware that on Monday there was a draft agreement put forward between the United Kingdom and the EU. So they're another step forward to finalizing their exit. And in my opinion, and I think the opinion of a number of my colleagues, this is a time when we need to be encouraging the United Kingdom. They're undeniably their defense partner, their NATO partner, and I think not exempting them would be a step in the wrong direction. The potential free trade agreement would be particularly good in services. But, I'd say that, not only are they a NATO partner, but if you look at how we are aligned with them in the promotion of capitalism, very few countries out there that promote it the same way that the United States and the United Kingdom do. Promotion of free markets, and perhaps most importantly of all is entrepreneurism. Entrepreneurism is alive and well in the United States, and it's alive and well in the United Kingdom, and it's not really alive and well in our sense of the word in a lot of other places around the world. So I would encourage you to work on that as expeditiously as possible. And I know that Liam Fox was here last week, the Minister of International Trade, and I'm sure that you all had several meetings, and I'd just give you a minute or so if you wanted to recap, have anything to say about those meetings and about any thoughts that you and the administration might have on our potential bilateral trade agreement.
Well, I would say, first of all, it is exactly as you say. I've met many times with Dr. Fox and found them all to be informative and enjoyable. We have an enormous amount in common. They clearly are. I think that it's probably the universal view in the administration that we should, at the appropriate time, explore the idea of an FTA with the UK. When that time is more up to them than it is to us. In the meantime, what we're trying to do is do the kinds of things that are in areas where they haven't ceded competence to the EU. So, for example, certifications of professionals. There's a lot of things we can do. We have a working group that we started, I guess, just about a year ago that's had a number of meetings, a number of staff level meetings, so we're getting a lot of the work done that would have to be done in advance of an FTA so that at the right time we can move quickly. The issue of the UK and 232 is a complicated one because of the fact that they're in the EU. So that is something that sort of has yet to be worked out. But clearly, an FTA with them, clearly other examples of working together is something that's very high on our priority list, and I see no impediments at all to moving in that direction at the appropriate time.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. I believe that a bilateral agreement with the United Kingdom could be a signature accomplishment of this administration and would be the first time that we've encapsulated in writing what the special relationship means. So it's a great opportunity for this administration to leave a lasting mark, not only on geopolitical politics, but on trade and trade policy. So thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Holding. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being our witness today. Clearly, there's strong bipartisan support that the best way to lower our trade deficits are not to buy less, but to sell more. We're confident in your ability in renegotiating NAFTA and other agreements to create a level playing field for American farmers and workers and businesses, because when you do, we win. And there's no doubt there's strong support for your very aggressive stance in opening these markets and modernizing NAFTA in a significant way. That's why 103 Republicans, your strongest supporters, are urging you to include strong accountability provisions, because we want your strong new trade agreement for America to be accountable and to be supported here in Congress. We look forward to being your partners and your clients as we go forward. Again, Ambassador, please advise members of the committee have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal record. With that, Mr. Ambassador, again, thank you. The committee stands adjourned.